Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Joining me today is astrologer Leisa Schaim, and we're going to be doing a deep dive into the meaning of the second house in astrology and explaining the significations of that house by looking at a ton of different example charts of different people that have second house placements, either planets in the second house, having the ruler of the ascendant in the second house, or looking at the ruler of the second house itself and what it means when it's located in different houses in order to get a comprehensive overview of what the second house means in a birth chart. So, hey, Lisa, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Chris, glad to be here.
Yeah, so this is a big one. I did a big episode on the first house last time with Nick, Nick, and Best. And today I've been talking to you about this as I've been researching it intensely over the past few weeks. And I found so many charts. You've also found some charts, and I think we have a lot of good stuff to say about the second house today.
Yeah, we have an abundance of charts, pardon the pun.
Abundance, a plethora that will come into play as we talk about some of these charts. We have some like billionaires and millionaires, including charts for some of the richest people in the world that I want to go through a little bit today. So let's start off first by I want to share a diagram that I have that shows the significations of the houses, and it shows where the second house is relative to the first house. So this is a diagram for those watching the video version that shows the significations of the houses. And the thing that's important here that I want to emphasize at the beginning is talking about the astronomical situation of the second house, because once you figure that out, it becomes pretty clear why the second house means what it means. So in the previous episode, I talked about the first house and how the first house, using whole sign houses used in ancient astrology, the degree of the ascendant, which represents the eastern horizon, will fall somewhere in the second house, or
The
sorry,
first house.
somewhere in the first house, and then part of the first house then will be above the horizon in the sky, which is the area of the chart that the ancient astrologers associate with the spirit and the mind and the intellect, basically everything in the top half of the chart. And then part of the first house is below the degree of the ascendant and is below the earth. So it represents everything that's below the earth in the material realm, which is the realm that they associated with the concept of fortune, with chance, but also with the body and the physical incarnation. So it's such a simple distinction, but it's one that had never been properly recognized in contemporary astrology until I started doing some work in 2012 on the planetary joys scheme, which is a system of assigning planets to the houses, and saw that it's built into the concept of the houses, just this idea that the top half of the chart with the sky is like the mind and the spirit and the intellect, and the bottom half of the chart is like the body, the physical incarnation, and the material world. So why that's important when it comes to the second house is the first house part is above the horizon, part is below the horizon, and so it's the meeting place between sky and earth, and also um, therefore it's the place where you are born and you come into this world and your spirit is sort of merged with your body. So the first house represents the self, it represents you in the chart and all the things associated with it. So the next house in order, the second house in whole sign houses is the second sign relative to the rising sign. So it's the sign that falls after the rising sign. And the second house is the first house that's fully submerged under the earth in the material realm and the realm of physical incarnation. And so the second house, as a result of that, has a lot to do with material things and with the material realm and everything associated with that, which functionally ends up resulting in it meaning that the second house signifies possessions, money, finances, income, and basically everything related to the material world when it comes to the native's life becomes the core meaning of the second house.
Right. Like, for instance, when a baby is born, the first things it more or less gets is, some sort of nourishment, like either breastfeeding or some sort of food. and then they're either put in some sort of clothing or wrapped in a blanket or something, regardless of the specifics. Like food and clothing are like your first things that are supporting your life as soon as you're born. And so it just keeps extending from there in terms of just the physical things that support the first house life.
Right, exactly. So, um, there's this notion. So, in the ancient astrology, it's referred to as the gate of Hades or the gate to the underworld, because you're fully entering this realm of like the underworld or going under the earth at this point and being fully enmeshed in the material realm. And I like what you said, though, that the second house, as a succedent house that follows after the first house, it supports the first house. So it
Mhm.
supports the native, and therefore it is those physical things that come to support you during the course of your life, and what your relation is to them, and how well you're supported materially and financially during the course of your existence, and the course of your like, occupation of this birth chart that will represent the rest of your life and your life journey.
Right. So, as an extension of that, it can show your literal finances or possessions, but it can also show your orientation towards the things that you need for life, i.e., money or possessions. So, so how you go about getting money, your sort of style of dealing with finances, which can be very different for different individuals, and so forth.
Yeah, for sure. So livelihood, like what do you do to support yourself? Livelihood is the primary keyword that was used for the second house in ancient astrology. It was the Greek word bios, which means life or livelihood. And So it means like making a living. Like, what do you do to make a living? And that when you're making a living, you're making an income. That's what's the thing that's necessary materially in order to support you and in order to get by and survive. And some people have different orientations towards that in terms of, for some people, that's an area of struggle where maybe material or financial things are a constant struggle for them that does not come easy, versus for other people, as we'll see, material or financial things is something that does come easy or in which they're tremendously fortunate. And that can really affect a lot of other things in the life, if depending on how things go in that area.
For sure. So in some charts, we'll see, it says something specific around the type of thing the person does to make an income, like literally the type of work they do. But of course, there's other work houses in the chart. So that can vary. Sometimes it is that specific, the connections between the second house and other houses. At other times, it speaks more in other charts, potentially it speaks more towards their orientation towards money, or, like you were just saying, how easy or hard it is to get money. There are different facets that kind of show more in some charts than others.
Yeah, for sure. And for some people, that's like a major part of the life, whereas for other people, it's not. And that's also sometimes reflected in the chart as well. If a person
Mhm.
has like a lot of planets in the second house, and that's like a major area of their life for some reason, or if a person doesn't have as much going on there. One thing I
Mhm.
meant to mention, because I got a ton of questions after the last episode, if you don't have any planets in a house, it doesn't mean that there's nothing going on there. You just have to look and see what the ruler of that house is doing, in order to get information about that house.
Absolutely. Yeah, that does come up a lot.
So that's something we'll be seeing a lot of. Okay, so just to finalize significations and run through them. So it's like money, finances, possessions, livelihood, income, resources, assets. One of the ones that came up that I was surprised at, but it made sense as I was doing this research, was that lifestyle seems to be a signification associated with the second house, because I was noticing, especially in the instances of some people that had like really extravagant lifestyles that were
Mhm.
sort of like demonstrations of their wealth, uh, that it was really coming up that lifestyle was like a core meaning in some ways, especially in terms of how do you maintain your lifestyle? Because
Mhm.
sometimes like people have a certain type of lifestyle that they want to support, and it becomes a question of like, what do I need to do financially in order to have the money to support that? And as well as sort of adjacent things like what kind of lifestyle does a person lead? Um, and what do they do in order to support that life.
For sure. Yeah, and even, with all things being equal, say like, two different people who have lots of money, their lifestyle can still look different in terms of like how they spend that money, how they save that money, etc.
Definitely. All right, other significations, making a living, attitude towards money and material possessions. Like some people have different attitudes towards these things. Earning potential, issues of wealth versus poverty can sometimes come up in terms of the second house and in terms of what planets are there or how the ruler of the house is situated and whether it's in good shape in the chart or poor shape in the chart. Spending habits. That's one of the things we'll see when we talk about planets in the house, especially that sometimes it can very much characterize the person's spending habits. Financial stability or lack thereof. Demetra, in her book, Ancient Astrology Volume 2, she has this amazing treatment of the significations of the houses, starting with the ancient astrologers and then going through to the medieval, Renaissance, and modern times. Some of the other significations she put in her chapter in Volume 2 of that work were expectations of prosperity, fears of financial lack, earning, saving, and spending habits, and one of the topics that can sometimes come up potentially is issues surrounding like greed, for example, can come up in connection with the second house. Um,
Hmm.
as as you said, as you said, the second house is also part of the trigon of houses that all have to do with like work and what you do to make a living. And the second house is like your livelihood and your income. The sixth house is work, subordinates, and also like labor or just areas in which you have to work for something and may not be in charge. And then the 10th house is like career and reputation and your overall life direction, and especially those areas of your life where you are in charge and you do some of your most important work or actions.
Right. So typically, if someone's actually looking at a chart to see something about like the type of work you'll do or how you'll make a living, it's not just one house. You would look at like the first house and ascendant ruler, second house, sixth, 10th, and do some sort of synthesis of like what does that all look like together? Because for some people, that's all easily connected. And it's like, this is what I do for work, and this is how I make a living, or this is my profession rather than this is how I make a living. But for other people, like say like artists or people who for whom it's not always easy, especially initially, to make a living from what they want to do for work. They're like two separate areas. And so they're making a living being a waiter or something, but they're also acting as like their profession. So you want to look at all of that.
Yeah, for sure. And as we'll see in the chart examples, it's rarely just a matter of, the second house, but usually there's many different things in the chart that are just describing the overall picture of what happens in terms of a person's work or income or other things like that. And sometimes those can be a little bit out of whack. Like a person can have a great career that they really enjoy doing what they love, but it cannot make them money, for example, and they could be struggling financially, even despite doing what they like doing. Or
Hmm.
alternatively, they could be making a lot of money and be really financially successful, but in terms of the 10th house and career, they don't get to do the thing that they really want to be doing and that they have a real passion for.
Hmm. Exactly.
So there's all sorts of different combinations in terms of that. In modern astrology, there's some additional like psychological significations that are sometimes emphasized. One of them is the notion of the second house being that which you put value into, like what you consider valuable. So we'll see a little bit of that to some extent because I did notice in some examples that it's like one of the things is you only pursue something because you have value or you covet it. And there's some examples I've seen with some people of pursuing some second house things because they place obvious value or a unique set of values on that material thing. But, other times that's not necessarily always the case because people sometimes just pursue second house things because they have to out of necessity.
Exactly. Exactly. Because we all, at minimum need subsistence to survive, however that comes about, or whatever our sort of overlay values on top of that. It's still like a material reality.
Yeah. So other things the modern astrologers sometimes associate in connection are how you acquire and manage things you value, your most valuable possessions, And sometimes in modern psychological astrology, they get into notions of the second house having to do with self-worth. And I'm not sure how much of that we'll see. We'll have to talk about that later. For the most part, we're going to focus, I did want to say, we're going to focus on more of a traditional approach to the significations of the houses in this series. And when it comes to the second house, which is going to be more limited in the sense that we're going to focus primarily on the second house having to do with concrete meanings of like finances and possessions and things like that.
Mm,
So the point is partially just to demonstrate and to show how those traditional significations actually do work out in people's lives. And in the one hand, that's going to be a little bit more narrow in that we're not going to be extending it as much to psychological things. But on the other hand, even by narrowly focusing on some of the core significations, as we'll see in the examples, there's such a wide variety of different ways that that can work out, especially based on the ruler of the second house being in different houses that yeah, there's a lot of different ways that can manifest in a person's life.
absolutely. And just kind of as a, secondary note about that, part of why we're doing that is, traditionally, if, especially you use whole sign houses and you look at the traditional placements and rulerships and so forth, um, you can see a lot of the concrete reality of any given area of the person's life, including the second house and finances. And while I think there's some credence sometimes to like self-worth being tied into your money in terms of if you don't feel like you're worth charging enough, if you're like self-employed, there are things like that that can come into play, certainly. But there's also many, many instances in which you can think you're great and you could be authentically great, but you are not in charge of all of the circumstances in which the context either allows or makes harder you're making a certain amount of money. And that's not all up to you, even if there's a self-worth component.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good point. All right. And the last thing I wanted to look up like a definition of livelihood because it was really the primary significations that the earliest astrologers gave for the second house. And I thought this was a good definition. So it said, livelihood refers to the means by which a person earns the money or resources necessary to support their basic needs and existence. So remember, the second house is a succeedant house. It rises up towards the first house and supports it. And the first house represents you. So the definition goes on, it says this typically includes securing food, shelter, clothing, and other essentials for daily living. In a broader sense, livelihood can also encompass the activities, skills, and assets that an individual or community relies on to make a living, whether through formal employment, self-employment, or subsistence practices. So, key points to remember: livelihood is fundamentally about securing the basic necessities of life. It can involve various forms of income generation and resource acquisition, and livelihoods can be diverse and vary across individuals, communities, and cultures. So, I think that sets a great overall tone for what we're going to be talking about here when it comes to the second house, and that we're going to be see demonstrated in such a wide variety of different ways.
For sure.
All right, cool. So let's transition. We're going to talk about chart examples at this point, and we're just going to go through as many chart examples as we can. I have actually way too many chart examples to go through in this episode, but we're going to see how many we can get through. My notes are actually about like 76 pages long at this point, the Google document that has all my research from the past month that I've been doing on this. Um, so we're going to see what we can get through. And in terms of structuring things, there were a few preface notes that I wanted to put before we get into chart examples. One, I wanted to give a shout out to three people for their research assistance as I was working on this. One of them is an astrologer named Orla, who gave me some help looking at planets in houses. Another is Nick Dagan Best, and the other is, of course, Leisa Schaim, who not just contributed some charts that you found, but also helped me talk through each of these examples as I was like excitedly finding new ones each day and then needed to tell somebody like how amazing they were.
Right. Yes. Yes. We've been talking about this for the past week or so.
At least, yeah, 2 weeks or so. Um, so the other thing, I used to be able to talk for hours on my own, and because this is mainly research that I did over the past few weeks of doing like maybe 50 chart examples, maybe 70 chart examples, I don't even know how many it is at this point. It's something that I would used to before maybe present in a lecture and as a solo just lecture presentation. And in some ways, ideally that might have been the better format since most of this is just presenting my research. But because of my health issues with chronic fatigue and long COVID over the past few years, I've lost the ability to do that because I both don't have the energy and my voice goes out if I talk too long on my own. So as a result of that, on the podcast, I often have people on to talk with me so that it's more of a conversation, and that allows me to not wear out my voice and to be able to keep talking. So Lisa's joining me for this today, both because she's a great astrologer and has researched some great examples that she's going to share, but also in order to help me talk through this. So I wanted to mention that because sometimes people complain if they hear me talking too much, not realizing that part of the reason for that is that people are actually joining me to help me out while I'm presenting my research.
Hmm. Right.
Yeah. So, all right. Um, uh, Other preface note, I'm going to use example charts from a wide variety of people from different walks of life. I'm going to avoid, for the most part, passing value judgments on the different charts, though, because there's so many different people. I have so many charts to get through that I feel like it would be like a whole separate thing, and I wouldn't be able to include as many charts if I spent a lot of time talking about certain things. And I think it's a given in some instances, like, for example, in other lectures, you might talk about Hitler's chart, but it's sort of like a given that Hitler was a bad guy and did terrible, terrible things, and sometimes doesn't always bear focusing on that or repeating just for the sake of giving an example of some certain part of a chart. So I wanted to state that from the outset as well.
Right. Sometimes it's interesting to find charts that of people that you personally find interesting or valuable in terms of their work. But obviously, for the sake of astrological presentation, you're really just looking for different astrological placements and expressions. And that's by necessity going to be kind of a range of humanity and a range of like people doing great things and not so great things. And, that's the nature of looking at astrological charts.
Yeah, for sure. And, in order to be able to see different ways that astrology works out, you're going to have to be able to look at charts of people you don't agree with or people that have done terrible things or that you find distasteful or what have you. But that's part of the territory in order to do this research and also even sometimes in terms of doing consultations and stuff and
Mhm.
what your role is as an astrologer in terms of that. So yeah, so I wanted to put that as a preface. Um, we already did the preface about focusing on the traditional meanings of the second house, so I think that's good. Um, yeah, shall we jump into it?
Yes, let's.
All right. So I was trying to figure out how to structure this because I have so many chart examples. And I want to start first. I want to break it up into 3 or 4 sections. The first section, I want to talk a little bit about some just basic examples of what it looks like when a person has a planet in the second house, and sometimes just the quality or the significations of that planet become manifest in the context of the livelihood or the income of the native. That it's just really obvious that the signification of the planet manifests in terms of the person's finances in some way. So the
Mm.
first section will be planets in the second house. The next section I want to do also is the ruler of the ascendant in the second house, because the ruler of the ascendant, as we saw in the last episode, can tell you something about the native's overall life direction and focus and some particular area of the life or area of the chart that the native is more focused on or that their life is more directed towards than others. So we're going to look at some examples of the ruler of the ascendant in the second house and what that looks like to see the second house as something that's more important in terms of the totality of the native's life direction. And then after that, we're also going to look at, in the next section, we'll look at the ruler of the second house when it's placed in different houses in the chart, um, and how that can tie together different parts of the person's life and the topics of 2 houses where the native's finances become enmeshed in or tied together with different parts of the person's life. So we'll look at that both in terms of the ruler of the second house as well as the ruler of other houses in the second house that then import significations into the second house.
Hmm. And these are rough categories. There will be many of them that, of course, cross those boundaries, but we're going to try to organize it that way.
Yeah, I think, because when we get to some of these examples, we'll probably mention some of those things when they come up. But
Hmm.
in terms of rough things, we'll start here.
Hmm.
So let me look at my planet in house examples and see where I want to start with. One of them that was my favorite that I've always used many different times, like it's one of my core examples, because it's such a good one, is Lisa Marie Presley, who was the daughter of Elvis Presley, the famous singer. And Lisa Marie Presley was born with Leo rising and Jupiter in Virgo in the second whole sign house in a day chart. So that means that Lisa Marie Presley was born with Jupiter in a day chart in the second house. Jupiter is the most positive planet in the chart then. And what happened is when her father passed away when she was relatively young, he left his entire estate to her, which was valued at millions of dollars. Um, but what was interesting is he actually stipulated that she couldn't inherit the full estate and take full control of it until she turned 25 years old. So the day that she turned 25 years old, she inherited Elvis's entire estate worth millions and millions of dollars. And if you use the technique annual perfections, where you count one sign per year from the ascendant, 25 years old is actually a second house perfection year and it activates the second house. So for people with second house placements, it can often be a very important year that in some ways activates the potential of the native's finances. So for her, it was inheriting her father's estate, uh, which made her very rich with Jupiter in the second house. And interestingly, it was an inheritance, and the ruler of her second house is Mercury, which is in Pisces in the eighth house of death and inheritance and other people's money. So the source of the wealth was from an inheritance from her father.
Right. So she's got both. She's got Mercury and Jupiter making a mutual reception between the second and eighth houses. And I know that something you found in your research is how much the eighth house was showing up in people who were very wealthy because of the nature of either inheritance or investments, like something dealing with other people's money, connecting with their own personal income and finances. And this is certainly one of those right off the bat. But Jupiter, of course, being the prime thing going on in a day chart in the second house. So just like abundance of, personal finances.
Yeah, exactly. And also, the ruler of the eighth house itself is Jupiter, which is in the
Right.
second house. So she has a mutual reception between the second house and the eighth house. And anytime you have a mutual reception, it really ties together the topics of those two houses very closely, as we'll see in other chart examples. And as I showed in the previous episode on the rulers of the houses.
Mhm.
The last point about hers is it's interesting because she also has Mars in the eighth house in a day chart, opposing some of the second house planets. And there were some issues where some of the funds were not invested wisely, and some of the inheritance money ended up being squandered or ended up being misappropriated by different advisors and stuff like that, so that she lost a lot of it.
Mhm.
Or and had to have some like legal battles surrounding that, I believe. So it's also a good example, not just of great a windfall and great good fortune in terms of finances, but also in terms of some challenges as well.
Right. Yeah. And people often wonder what happens when there's like a mix of those planets going on in certain areas of life, and it's usually that there's a mix of qualities that come out, over time.
For sure, for sure. Okay, so let me see other ones. Oh yeah, like this is one that's like very frequently cited, but another Jupiter in the second house chart is Bill Gates, who was born with Cancer rising and Jupiter conjunct Pluto in the second house. And Bill Gates, of course, at different points has been the richest person in the world or the richest man in the world at different points over the past 2 decades. So it's not just Jupiter, but it's also conjunct Pluto, and
Mm.
Pluto tends to take things to the utmost extreme, or it takes things to extremes. So it's interesting in that case that he became not just a rich person, but like a mega rich person, like the most rich person.
Right. Jupiter, Pluto together, especially when they're tightly together like that, it can often be like big, big money.
Yeah, exactly. So those are some Jupiter placements. Let's alternate to some Saturn placements.
Okay.
So maybe we should do one that was more challenging, but it had a good example with Octavia E. Butler.
Okay.
All right. So here's her chart. It's um, Cancer rising with Mercury conjunct the degree of the ascendant. And the ruler of the ascendant is the moon, which is placed in Leo in the second house. And in the second house, we also find Saturn and Pluto in a day chart.
Mm.
So, Octavia Butler was a science fiction writer. So she was a writer with Mercury conjunct the ascendant. But she was a writer who struggled with financial issues very early in her life with Saturn conjunct or Saturn there conjunct Pluto in the second house, right?
Right. Yeah, she grew up with her mother being a house cleaner. So they didn't have much money. And then she herself ended up taking lots of temporary jobs, factory jobs, things like this, in order to make a living until she could make a living from her writing itself. And you can see finances is like a big theme here because she's got the ascendant ruler in the second, with the moon ruling the first and the second, and also transposed the sun ruling the second in the first. So she's got both of those going on. So it's like making finances really important. But Saturn and Pluto there, making it challenging in the second house. And also the moon is the moon placed in the second square, closely square Mars in a day chart. So that's making things challenging as well for finances. But and someone I read an interview with someone who had like looked through her journals and diaries, and there were like lots of notes that sort of indicated notes to herself that indicated just like financial struggle, but like aspiration as well. Um, and one thing I loved about it though is that it said in 1978 is when she finally could stop doing her temporary jobs and fully support herself at some level with her writing. And 1978 was the year that Saturn, the last year that Saturn was in Leo. It was going back and forth between Virgo and Leo. So that was like the end of her first Saturn return, which is amazing, right? In the second house.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Here, I'll share that. Here's 19. Can you see the bi-wheel with
Hmm.
1978?
Yes.
So there's Saturn there in her second house.
Right. And so the end of her Saturn return would have also been Saturn near the ascendant ruler moon in the second. So just really emphasizing that being the Saturn return achievement of like financial, at least some level of financial stability through doing her the work that she wanted to do for money instead of other random jobs.
Right. Um, and one of the things I was reading that was really interesting is that her novels often explored themes of power, inequality, and social structures, and money and possessions actually frequently played a significant role, where her works would depict societies where wealth and resources were unevenly distributed, and this led to conflict and oppression. So she would often like challenge readers to consider the impact of economic disparities and the ways in which material wealth could be used to exert control or create social change.
Hmm. And that's something that I love in astrology that you can see with philosophers and writers and people who put their ideas out there is that it's often like the main themes will be reflected in the personal individual natal chart because it's like it's showing up as very vital to the person as an individual and then that gets expressed through their writings.
Right. So one other thing that's really impressive about her is that she was the first science fiction writer. She made history actually as becoming the first science fiction writer to receive the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship. Um, and this was huge for any science fiction writer, so that it was a great recognition of her work, but it also came with a big cash like prize basically that was paid out over 5 years, where she was paid $300,000 each year for the next 5 years.
Mm.
And so there was actually at one point a significant financial shift for her. Obviously, her life was like a progression of financial shifts, like the one you mentioned earlier when she was in her Saturn return. This one I thought was interesting because I looked at the transits for when it was announced, which I believe was around June 20th, 1995, and transiting Jupiter was at 8 degrees of Sagittarius, and it was retrograding back to 7 degrees, where it was trining her natal Saturn at 7 degrees of Leo. So that's another aspect of things that I want to emphasize today. In some instances, sometimes it would be just be looking at the natal placement and seeing how that worked out sort of universally at different points in the life with specific instances or events that were characteristic of the life. In some instances, I actually want to look at the transits and show how those second house placements were actually being activated when they were either good or bad, or let's say challenging things that occurred in the person's life. In this
Mm.
instance, she had a really positive thing happen, and she was having a very positive transit at that time to her second house Saturn.
Right. And interestingly, as well, Saturn rules the eighth house. And there was a different conversation or a recounting of a conversation published online where someone asked her, so what did winning that prize do for you? And she said, I was able to finally buy a home in a safe neighborhood. And Saturn is like ruling the eighth house, which would be like the mortgage, right? Um, to buy a home, the eighth house often shows up, even though the home is the fourth house, because it's like the financing of the home. Um, and it was a little sobering to me because they were noting she would have been wealthy now, had she lived longer. But at that time, it allowed her to get that mortgage and the home, but she was like still paying off the mortgage. So
Hmm.
just kind of an example of how, like, notability, like professional notability, and the income area are not always the same thing in the chart at all.
Yeah, for sure. But it's interesting that, the ruler of the ascendant was there in the second house, so that the second house is obviously a major topic throughout her life. She
Mm.
integrated second house themes into her writings and into her works.
Hmm.
And then, but our primary, we were also using it as an example that Saturn in the second house can sometimes be difficult, especially earlier in the life. Especially for her, since she had a day chart, Saturn tends to be something that gets better with age.
Mm.
And while she had great struggles and hardships in that area with Saturn in the second house, eventually it became an area where things worked out better as she got older.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So that's a good example of just it's not always terrible or like the worst case scenario if you have difficult planets like Saturn in the second house. And
Hmm.
actually, I have another example of that, which is my next example, which is the birth chart of Warren Buffett, who is a famous investor who has Sagittarius rising and Saturn in Capricorn in the second house in a day chart.
Hmm.
So, I wanted to use this as an example of how, malefics in the second house, especially if they're well placed, are not always the worst case scenario. He's somebody that became one of the richest people in the world. Um, but I wanted to use him as an example also because sometimes the planets in the second house can describe one's orientation towards money, but also how they go about spending money and acquiring money.
Hmm.
So, another astrologer, Beth Watson, who's the wife of our, friend and frequent show collaborator, Patrick Watson. I was talking to her about this, and she said, what a good example that Warren Buffett is. And she sent me a paragraph, which she said I could read. So she said, I think it's cool about his second house, how Saturn is there, and how well that represents his trading strategy. Heavy Capricorn energy. He's a no fuss, no frills fundamentals trader and was one of the first to popularize value investing or finding stocks that he believed through his analysis were worth far more than their intrinsic value. Some of those stocks were a slow burn, but netted him brilliant returns in the long run. Um, and so I thought that's really important because I was looking at more about him and just his approach. And he's known for value investing, which is seeking companies that he believes are undervalued by the market, and then he focuses on long-term things. So he's famous for his approach of buying and holding and emphasizing long-term gains over short-term speculation. And then finally, he's also very fundamentals driven, where he focuses on a company's underlying fundamentals and intrinsic value, not market hype. So one last thing that Beth mentioned is he was born actually just before Saturn was about to station direct. Let me see how far. You can see it. Yeah, you can see it
Mhm.
in the bottom right corner of the page. It says he was born about 10 days before Saturn would station direct in Capricorn, which always puts a major emphasis or like an exclamation mark next to a planet in a person's chart. And Beth was saying that she looked up Buffett's secondary progressions, and because it was, Saturn stationed 10 days after his birth, that would be associated then in secondary progressions. It means by secondary progression, his Saturn stationed direct when he was 10 or 11 years old. And she looked it up, and he actually bought his first stock at age 11. So that's when he started investing.
That's so funny and like concrete and literal. Um, yeah,
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 isn't that incredible?
yeah. Yeah,
So
because
that's just,
oftentimes when like a secondary progressed planet stations to go direct, it'll like bring out the expression of like whatever that's about and make it more important and show up more obviously in your life.
yeah, for sure. So obviously there's other things going on in his chart. His chart is actually very eighth house focused, and that's something that comes up majorly with investors and people that are very wealthy, like billionaires. I'll
Mm,
save the rest of that for like the eighth house episode. But
mm,
I just wanted to show how sometimes Saturn in the second not only can, if it's very well placed, like for example, this is probably the most well placed Saturn you could get in the second house because it's
mm.
in its own domicile, it's in a date chart, it's stationing direct, but how that can actually be good, especially in the long term, that Saturn in the second is not necessarily a terrible deal breaker per se.
Right. And how that's expressed well is if you do Saturn around that, around that area of life in which he has.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So moving on. Oh yeah, one of them that I found that was really funny. Was the moon in the second house. I found a couple of distinctive things with the moon in the second house, but one of them that was very funny and literal was that um, Martha Stewart has the moon in the second house.
Mm,
So here is her chart. She has Scorpio rising with the moon in Sagittarius in the second whole sign house. The ruler of the second house is Jupiter, which is in Gemini in the eighth house in a date chart. And Martha Stewart, the primary thing is just with the moon there in the second house that I found so fascinating is that she's known for, cooking for a series of cookware and cooking shows and books, and also like home decorating and things like that. So all these things
right.
related to the moon manifesting in the second house is how she made her living and became like a millionaire.
Right. And sometimes it's just as simple as that, at least in terms of one of the big themes of livelihood. Like, what is the nature of that planet? What are its significations?
Yeah, sometimes it can be as simple as that. So cookbooks and magazines, home decor and kitchenware products, and different things like that. Interestingly, with the ruler of the second in the eighth house, she also became very wealthy as a result of making a lot of very shrewd investments in various businesses.
Hmm.
Let me go back to her chart. There's that Jupiter in the eighth house. So she was also like an investor, and that added to her wealth. However, she also got caught up and got in trouble for that at one point as well, where she got in trouble for trading basically, and she went to jail for 5 months, plus got 2 years probation due to a sort of insider trading scandal, essentially.
Hmm. Right. Right. So that Jupiter was generally doing, good, abundant things for her, but there's still the shadow side that can come out, if you take that too far.
Yeah, where sometimes things can get tricky. And what was interesting about that is um, that I found was that Saturn was transiting her Jupiter in Gemini when she first made the trade in late 2001, and then she started being investigated in early 2002. And at
Mm,
the same time, Pluto was going through Sagittarius, her second house, and was opposing her Jupiter.
mm.
And there was also an eclipse in her second house around that time as well.
Wow, that's a
Um,
lot.
so it's like even if a person has like really good placements in the second house or the eighth house, sometimes if you have a really tough transit,
Mm,
in 2001, like a lot of the astrologers associated 9/11 with the Saturn Pluto opposition.
Mhm.
And for her, what was interesting is that Saturn Pluto opposition was hitting her financial sector of her chart and hitting her Jupiter.
Mm.
So the point is just sometimes, even if you have really good placements, even the most fortunate or lucky people at some point in their life, have some difficulties or run into some challenges related to different parts of their chart. And
Mm.
that's going to happen when you have the more challenging transits.
For sure. Do we know if she like knowingly did anything improper there or if it was like something that she was advised to do? I was just curious.
I don't know. It's like really,
Okay.
it's really complicated. Like I have a whole thing, because part of it had to do with her questioning and like what she said to the prosecutors.
Okay.
Um, because they accused her of making non acting on non-public knowledge when they made the trade. But then the big thing I think was that they accused her of lying to it to the feds when they came asking questions, and that may have
Mm.
been part of the major issues,
I see. Okay.
obstruction of justice.
Hmm.
So I don't know. We don't have to like get
Okay. I was just
into
curious.
the details again with our not pass judgment
Not passing judgment.
thing.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
can't say. There's actually a few examples like that where I'm going to raise, speculations or different people like have speculated a different way, but that we don't truly know, but that it is
Mm.
just interesting to look at the astrology and see how it's activated.
Right. Right.
Yeah. All right. So let me go back to my list. So oh yeah, another one that kept coming up with the moon that I found really fascinating is collectors and people that liked to collect things.
Right.
And I thought that was so hilarious because um, the moon itself, that's one of its basic significations in Hellenistic astrology, is that it collects
Relax. Yeah.
things and it receives the light of the sun. And so that it's about receiving or collecting or being receptive to things is just a basic principle.
Right. Yeah. Totally. And it's really funny when that comes out literally, like in a couple of these examples.
Yeah, so that's one collection, and I'll show a couple examples of that. Another one that I need to introduce also that comes up is sometimes when Mars is in the second house, it can have to do with taking things,
Hmm.
or Mars it severs and separates as a basic principle, but it also can take things and is associated with like theft, for example, in ancient astrology. And sometimes if it's poorly placed and you get a bad transit, can indicate like a person has an incidence of like theft where somebody steals from them.
Mm.
But interestingly, I found an example of somebody who liked to steal things from other people who had Mars in the second house.
Hmm.
So this is kind of an elaborate example, but it was a really good one. So this is the birth chart of King Farouk of Egypt, who was the king of Egypt in the 1930s and 40s, but he ended up effectively becoming the last king of Egypt because he was overthrown and exiled from Egypt and then ended up dying in exile like years later, living in Italy, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So for those listening to the audio version, we have a chart with Libra rising, Mars and Jupiter in Scorpio in the second house, along with the North Node. Um,
Mars and the moon.
sorry, yeah. Mars and the Moon and the North Node in Scorpio in the second house,
Mm.
and Jupiter is in Leo in the 11th house, overcoming through a superior square those Moon and Mars placements in Scorpio.
Hmm.
And then what else is going on here? We have a nice sextile from Venus in the fourth house to some of the Scorpio planets. But the big thing about him that came up without going into his entire biography is um, one, he was kind of like a prankster. He grew up in extreme wealth, but he was kind of like he sounded almost like a little mischievous. But he apparently, with Mars in the second house, he was taught at one point they caught in Egypt like somebody who was a pickpocket, and he made a deal with the pickpocket to not, you know, charge him and to let him go if the pickpocket would teach him how to pickpocket people. And so the king learned how to do this, but then he decided to do it on like really famous people where he would like pickpocket um, them, including he used this skill on Winston Churchill at one point to like steal one of his watches. And um, another person, he stole a ceremonial sword from the Shah of Iran. So it's basically in his biographies, it says, despite his great wealth, Farouk was a kleptomaniac who always took something valuable, such as a painting or a piano, from whatever members of the Egyptian elite that he stayed with, as nobody could say no to the king. And if he indicated he wanted something, his subjects had to give it to him. So it's true for his subjects, but it's also true for like, other high officials in like other countries. Like Winston Churchill was the prime minister of the UK.
Hmm.
So his second house is actually extremely well placed in terms of at least this being a night chart with Mars in its own domicile. Um, yeah, relatively well situated. But then
Hmm.
also we find the moon there in the second house, and it turned out that he was a huge collector. That he had, it said that he had something of a mania for collecting things, is what one of the biographies said, ranging from Coca-Cola bottles to European art to ancient Egyptian antiques.
Hmm.
So, looking at my notes here for just some of the stuff because what happened is after he was overthrown in essentially like a military coup and he was forced to abdicate, um, the Egyptian government moved to auction off his vast collection of trinkets and treasures. And then they just started finding that he had all of this stuff and that he had the hugest collection of a bunch of different things in the world at that time. So one of the things that he had, for example, is he had the biggest coin collection in the world at that point. He also possessed a vast collection, numbering into the hundreds of thousands of. It turned out he had the largest collection of pornography in the world, for example, and this is in like the 1940s or 1950s. And it's funny that it's in Scorpio, and it's also funny that it's like the moon is ruling the 10th house. So just imagine that that becomes one of your reputations.
Right, totally.
Um,
Right. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, it's just such an interesting second house, right? Because the moon with the collecting and Mars is well placed in a night chart in its own sign. So it shows that he had, the means there. He had second house, abundance going on, but it's also Mars, and malefics, even if they're insect, it doesn't mean they turn into like the benefic necessarily. So it's like
Right.
that was some of his struggle still, the desire, right?
Yeah, they like
And
they like to take things and also like Austin talks about in his book on the decans, which evidently nobody has. Like we're very lucky people that have the
right.
first edition because it's
Yes.
been out of print forever. But he talks about
Yes.
the first decan of Scorpio, and one of the keywords he uses for it is hunger. And that
Yes.
actually came up very strongly in this guy's biography because they said that he had a hunger for collecting things for like possessions and goods,
Mm,
but also even for like eating and stuff and having these like wildly opulent meals.
mm,
So much so that eventually, he did that for many, many years and he became very overweight relative to the time. He had
mm,
this hunger, like this desire for women and for sex, and had lots of different like lovers during the course of his life, and that seems like it became tied in with his second house to some extent as well.
right. Really interesting with the first decan, because yeah, I remember that signification as well. But it's like he has a few different things kind of showing up to me anyway as sort of the insatiable desire factor, which is that one. And then with that Jupiter overcoming Mars, but it's in a night chart. So like Mars, Jupiter can like expand the desire. And especially if it's in a night chart, it's not necessarily in like useful ways,
Right.
Um, just sort of greed. And then I know it doesn't always show up this way, but it's really interesting that he has such a close conjunction between the moon and the North Node in the second house in
Mm.
Scorpio, because I've seen that The North Node, particularly, of course, in Indian astrology, is like known as like the insatiable want, the head that keeps wanting more, right?
Oh yeah, for
Head of
sure.
the serpent. And but the moon right there, yeah, I can see that just being like an instinct of like wanting more and wanting more with a few different, things around his second house there.
Right, for sure. Um, so some of the summaries I was like reading and writing were that Farouk the first of Egypt's finances were characterized by extreme wealth and extravagance, ultimately contributing to his downfall and the 1952 revolution that overthrew the monarchy, and that his finances were a stark contrast between immense wealth and irresponsible spending. That's actually something I see come up regularly with Mars in the second house. Johnny Depp, for example, has that. And
Mm-hmm.
there's speculations that he may have spent like a lot of the $600 million that he made through his Hollywood career over the past few decades on like wild extravagant spending.
Yeah, I saw that
Um,
on several different celebrities who were like known to like squander their wealth. They had like Mars as well as like Jupiter going on with the second house.
right. Yeah. So it continues, it says Farouk's extravagance and disregard for the economic realities of his people alienated him from the public and contributed to the revolution that ultimately ended his reign and the Egyptian monarchy, so that his story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and wealth. And in terms of some of the stuff that he had, when they found his palace and they started discovering stuff, they found that he collected 2,000 silk shirts, 10,000 silk ties, 50 diamond-studded golden walking sticks, and one autographed portrait from of Adolf Hitler, which is kind of weird.
Mm.
Um, he Elsewhere it says his obsession with collection also ranged into diamonds, dogs, stamps, rubies, Fabergé eggs, ancient Tibetan coins, medieval suits of armor, aspirin bottles, razor blades, paper clips, and Geiger counters.
That's so random.
So, right, it's so crazy. So it's like I'm just trying to give some, yeah,
Yeah.
sense of
Show the picture, right?
exactly. But it's like it's like even though Mars is well placed, that moon is not well placed, and
Hmm.
obviously that's potentially also part of the hunger part and part of the insatiable conjunct the North Node, as you were saying, but then also to just to become known for that in terms of your reputation and the
Mm,
mark that you leave on the world with the
right.
moon ruling the 10th house of career, I think is really notable.
Yeah, that's very striking. Yeah, really tying together, yeah, your public reputation, at least eventually, and the second house of like possessions and wealth.
Yeah. It says the 1954 auction of his coin collection was the biggest auction of the 20th century. Um, so having the biggest of something. So this is obviously somebody who has major second house placement and whose money and finances came up in a very, very significant way. One
Mm.
last point to mention is just he was forced to, let me do animate by wheel to show you the transits. No, I'm spending a lot of time on this one, but I found some of these ones that just I hadn't known about. I think Orla was the one that pointed this chart out to me, and I'm just shocked at how good it is and how
Mm.
fascinating like the lives of some of these people are.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Go ahead.
what were you gonna say?
I was just gonna say it was a little bit of a rabbit hole, I know, on the biography on this person, but sometimes, yeah, you're just like so excited about, how well the astrology fits, and what a good example this is.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the last point I want to share, just that I was fascinated by because I thought it was a great example of a transit. This is the chart, so you can see the bi-wheel, right?
Yes.
So on July 26, 1952, he was forced to abdicate his throne and he was exiled in a military coup. Look at where Mars is. Mars is in Scorpio. It's transiting his second house.
Mm.
So, and he has a day chart. Or no, he has a night
No, just a
chart, but
night chart.
nonetheless, Mars is transiting his second house. And it's
Mm.
like that was the big thing is he then lost all of his wealth for the most part. He lost all of his possessions that then get auctioned off. And it
Mm.
all starts under this transit of Mars through the second house.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
really interesting. And it's, of course, backed up by Saturn and Neptune transiting the first in a night chart. He's got
yeah,
like,
which
Yeah,
which is
exactly.
really hard from him personally. But then,
Yeah.
I just mentioned how the biggest auction of his coin collection happened in 1954. Look where Saturn is in 1954. Saturn goes into his second house, and basically they start selling off all of his stuff over that
Wow.
2 or 3 year period.
Wow. Wait, was that when he was still alive or not alive?
Yeah, he stayed alive for like
Okay.
a while after that. I mean, one of the things that was weird is that he had just had a son in 1952, right before the revolution,
Mm,
and they actually initially made his son king. So
mm,
technically his like infant son became the last king of Egypt.
mm.
But then after like a year, they got rid of that and just made it a republic basically, and the end of a long reign of, monarchs ruling Egypt.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So anyway, that's one of the most extravagant examples. Actually, I have many
Yeah.
other extravagant examples because I started getting into the charts of like billionaires and like the richest people in the world.
Mm,
But that was one of the more interesting ones in terms of how, as we were saying, sometimes planets in the second house can describe your orientation towards middle to material things.
mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah. All right. Let's see if there's other.
I like the
Actually,
oh, go ahead.
what were you gonna say?
I like the Danny DeVito one as a
Okay.
Venus. We don't really have Venus ones. Um, do you have the data for that one?
Yeah, I have
Okay.
it up right here.
Okay. Okay. So it's not on the screen yet. Okay, there we go. So Danny DeVito. So I know it's really interesting. So natal charts have to reflect your entire life, and then the timing sort of shows its unfoldment, right? So people often wonder what celebrities did like before they became super famous. And so Danny DeVito is, of course, a famous actor. But before he was a famous actor, one of the things he did for income was he worked in his sister's beauty salon. She sent him to beauty school to cut clients' hair in her salon. And so I just like that as a Venus in the second house, example of just like beauty as a general signification. But one of the funnier things about it and more unique things about it was so her salon kind of the clientele just ended up being elderly women, like for the most part. And he found himself in the circumstance where he would cut these very old ladies' hair, and then some of them would pass away, and their families would know that he was like their hairdresser. And so they would ask him to do the person's hair, like for their funeral. And so Danny DeVito has Venus in the second house, it's in Capricorn, ruled by Saturn in the eighth house. And it's just
Mhm.
like, again, another funny, like literal example, right? It's tying together the signification of beauty as like the form of income, but it's connected with the topic of mortality, literally, with Saturn in the eighth house, both the eighth house governing the topic of mortality and Saturn as a general significator of old age and death. And I thought that was like a fascinating one.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah. Oh, Saturn also rules the second and third. So you often see topics tied together of houses that are ruled by the same planet. And so it was literally his sister's salon, and she was the one who pushed him to go to beauty school, and I think maybe paid for it. And so Saturn's tying together the topics of the second house of income and the third house of siblings.
Nice. Yeah, that's something that we're going to see a lot of, that you have to pay attention to both of the houses the planet rules, and then it will often import those significations into the second house, or alternatively, that you have to pay attention to both houses that the ruler of the second rules, as well as the house that it's located in, and it will tie those together.
Exactly.
The astrology software that we use on the astrology podcast is called Solar Fire for Windows. And you can get a 15% discount on the software by using the promo code AP15 when you purchase it through alabe.com. For Mac users, we recommend the program Astro Gold for Mac OS, and you can also get a 15% discount when you use the promo code AstroPodcast15 at the website astrogold.io. All right, we're back from break. So I want to quickly go through a few more planet examples in order to round this out. So one of them I want to talk about quickly is Bernie Madoff, who had Leo rising and Neptune in the second house of money and possessions. And he was actually known for committing the largest Ponzi scheme in history, which was a form of financial fraud, essentially, right?
Exactly. It's when you get new investors or new victims, as the case may be, to pay off what you owe to the older people.
Right. So it's like you get people to invest in something, you take their money and then you spend it. And then in order to pay back the person you just took the money from, you get somebody else to invest money and then you
Mhm.
take their money and give it to the first person.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting just in terms of the deceptive quality of Neptune. And for him, he used it obviously negatively there in his second house. There's
Mm.
other stuff going on in his chart as well. Like he has retrograde Mercury ruling it, square Pluto. But interestingly, you actually found another relevant chart for that because you found another one, right?
Yeah, the chart of Charles Ponzi himself. Surprisingly, there was a birth time for, who was, of course, who the Ponzi scheme, famously was named after. He was like the first guy, not probably not the first guy in history to do this, but he was the first guy who, like, notably was really famous for doing this, and then, had this phenomenon named after him, sort of infamous legacy.
There it is. It's taking me a minute to find it, but here's
Yeah.
the chart.
hmm so this one, it's more about the ruler of the second. So this one is a night chart, North Node in the second. Jupiter is ruling it in a night chart placed in the seventh house of like the other party, the other person. It's somewhat closely conjunct Pluto. It's a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, which we've talked about, big money. But it's night chart Jupiter, so that can be a little bit of an overabundance without foundation.
Yeah,
Neptune
that's
and
interesting in terms of just the Madoff had like the ruler of the second square Pluto, and here we find Charles Ponzi with the ruler of the second conjunct Pluto, and just
right.
the manipulative component of Pluto sometimes.
Yeah, and also just making things even bigger, which is a, Jupiter Pluto thing. And so he's also got Neptune and Saturn in the seventh as well. So he's got a big seventh house stellium, with the ruler of the second house. And I just thought that was really funny and evocative in terms of the nature of the Ponzi scheme. The phenomenon is just getting more and more people involved. And right, like you just always need like new clients, new, clients slash victims. And that's just like what is Jupiter, Pluto in the seventh, but like, lots and lots of people. So, and of course, Saturn there is not great because it is a night chart. Neptune is there for the illusory aspect, and so forth. And interestingly, Pluto's squaring the midheaven as well. Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. So just Jupiter in this ruler of the second and the seventh, and like in his instance, like taking money from other people.
Right. And it became big money, but then, of course, it was illusory, and then he lost the entire thing.
Right, for sure. All right, that's pretty good. Other ones
Oh,
that
there was something about that one. It was actually in a second. Surprisingly, for how famous this is, it all happened within less than a year in 1919 and 1920. And when this all went down, when he started it, he was 37, which is a second house perfection year, which I thought was perfect. So it's really highlighting that stellium that year.
nice. So yeah, it activated that Jupiter, which is in the seventh house. But sometimes, in terms of just doing research, to take a step back as a meta thing, like a good way to confirm sometimes when you think, you're looking at a natal chart signature placement that means something, to then look at the transits and the perfections to see if that was activated at the time of the event that it occurred. And that can often act as a good confirmation that you are looking at the right signature in the chart.
Exactly.
Nice, nice. All right. That's good. Other examples. One of the ones that was interesting, this is one I just found that we had a birth time for recently because she died recently, but Dr. Ruth, who was like a famous, just like a writer basically, as well as like talk show host and radio show host. She was born with Gemini rising, with Mercury ruling the ascendant, placed in Cancer in the second whole sign house, conjunct Pluto and squaring Mars and Uranus. And the basic point for this, just in terms of a planet example, is just that she was primarily like a writer and a speaker, and that's how she made her money. She also was known for being very frank or blunt and not shying away from saying things or getting into topics that were taboo, especially for the time. And I think that's where those other planetary connections with Mercury are coming out with like Pluto and willing to talk about taboo things. Mars square Mercury can be very blunt, sometimes too much at times, and squaring Uranus can bring a like rebel sort of quality to the person's communication style.
Right, and it's funny because, of course, now that's not as taboo, but, this chart is showing the context of her life, and earlier on, it certainly was. And you'll find that, with any planets co-present, even if they're not super close by conjunction.
Yeah, it absolutely like was taboo at the time, like and then
Mhm,
especially like the 1980s or even 90s when she was talking about some of that stuff, it was like seen as very like risque.
exactly.
Yeah, so that's good. All right, looking at my other examples, I wanted to mention yeah, Lillian Betancourt, who was the richest woman in the world for a period of time. And she was born with Scorpio rising and Venus in the second house. And she was the heir to the L'Oreal makeup and cosmetics empire, basically. And I
Mm,
thought that was a brilliant that her income and stuff came through makeup and cosmetics, and she
mhm,
became the richest woman in the world at one point through that with Venus
mhm.
in the second house.
Right, right, and of course, she also has both benefics connected since Jupiter is ruling, which reinforces the positivity of her second house, but yeah, just the nature of Venus as a general significator for beauty.
Yeah. So she was a French heiress, socialite, and businesswoman. She does have that mutual reception with the 12th house. And that at one point, I just learned about her as I was doing this research. And so I had to research her biography. And I was really curious because she has that strong connection between Venus is in the second house, but it's ruling the seventh house of relationships, as well as the 12th house of loss, enemies, and self-undoing. And I
Mm,
was wondering how that 12th house played in because there's such a strong connection there. And what came up is that in the last few decades of her life, she got in some kind of connection or relationship with this guy who was like a photographer. And her daughter eventually had to um, contact the police and basically press police charges because she thought her mother was being taken advantage of by this man who she ended up gifting him millions and millions of dollars worth of gifts and stuff. Like I think it totaled to end up being like $1 billion or like something crazy like that.
mm,
And the courts eventually did decide that, yeah, it was estimated. So it says she gave him huge amounts of money and gifts over the years, estimated to be worth $1.3 billion. And these gifts included, among other things, a life insurance policy worth 253 million in 2003, another life insurance policy which worth 262 million in 2006, 11 works of art in 2001 valued at $20 million, including paintings by Picasso, Matisse, Mondrian, and a bunch of others, a photograph by surrealist Man Ray and Cash. So her daughter eventually filed a criminal complaint saying her mother was being exploited as a result of a psychological weakness by this guy. And her butler feared that Bettencourt was suffering from Alzheimer's disease and was being duped.
mm.
At one point, she even attempted to make the guy her sole heir.
Well,
But then eventually she separated with him and wrote him out of her will. And not long after that, she was put under a guardianship due to her declining mental health.
mm,
So I thought that was incredible because, some of those 12th house things really came alive there, including mental health stuff, including potentially like people that are working against you, or
mm,
sometimes self-undoing, like when you're doing something yourself that's undermining you, but you don't realize it, as
mhm.
well as Venus ruling the seventh house of relationships.
For sure. Pulling together the topics of the second house and the seventh into like the self undoing or loss. It's interesting also that stellium in Libra and that so a lot of that was like really valuable artwork that was being given away. Um, as well as like the life insurance policy, Mercury ruling the eighth, placed in that stellium in the 12th.
Exactly. And I've come across that a few times, and I'll do that as the next example, but where sometimes the quality of the sign can describe like what the person spends money on or what the expense is. And Libra keeps coming up as like art and
Mm-hmm.
paintings, especially. Madonna is a really great example of that I'll share next, who has Jupiter in Libra in the second house, and she has over $100 million worth of art and especially paintings that she says is like an indulgence of hers spending money on art.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Yeah, so I want to talk about that. Um, her, we actually have the chart of the daughter that I was just talking about, which is really
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. Her name is Francois Betancourt Myers. She's actually currently the richest woman in the world. What was interesting though about this is she's more kind of like academic and kind of nerdy, and she's written a few books. And it's interesting because you see both of her benefics in the third house, including the ruler of her second. And she's written a book on like the genealogy of the Greek gods, which is really fascinating, as well as some Bible commentaries because she's interested in religion with
Mm-hmm.
the ruler of the ninth in the third house.
Yeah.
But then we see the ruler of her ascendant with Aries rising is that Mars in Cancer in the fourth house conjunct the sun and the moon and Uranus. And a lot of that is just descriptive of the fights she had basically with her mother in the later part of her life, and especially in terms of getting her mother to relinquish control and who was struggling with these mental issues and being taken advantage of this guy, but they had very
Mm-hmm.
public disputes as a result of the attempts, I think, to fix that. She was born actually the day before a solar eclipse in Cancer, and it shows up very prominently in her chart.
Yeah, wow. That's really striking, especially with the Mars Kazibi. It's like it's a Mars Sun tight conjunction ruling her ascendant and then placed in the fourth. So that's like a huge piece of like her life's journey, and life's focus. And that those are like fairly closely square Saturn. It's a night chart, even though it's Saturn exalted, so there's mitigation there, of course, but it is still Saturn in a night chart. So yeah, that looks actually kind of rough. It's
Yeah.
interesting sometimes how like the chart can show something being rough that's like a focus of the person's life, even if you think outwardly like, oh, they look like they have it made, right? They have lots of money and so forth. But this is like, no, but the focus has been like, a real challenge around family.
Yeah. They had some very public um disputes and spats, and like some very negative things were said in the public,
Mm.
um, especially of the mom towards her daughter and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Interesting.
Yeah. So I thought those are interesting just in terms of as I was going through, I was trying to find not just some of the richest men in the world, like, Bill Gates or um, what the other investor that we did, but also some of the richest women in the world and finding that we actually had birth charts for some of them, which was fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. We have Mackenzie Scott coming up. I don't know where you put that, but
Yeah.
yeah.
That is an amazing one.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about Madonna since I just mentioned her, and then
Okay.
let's do Mackenzie Scott because that's an amazing one.
Yeah. Okay.
It's hard. I meant to say just birth data collections for some reason tend to be skewed towards men, and we have more timed birth charts for men.
Mm.
This is starting to be rectified, but part of that is also part of due to the historical thing of women not being able to, pursue careers or receive the same education as men or other things, and for whatever reason a lot of our birth data is skewed towards men due to some of those historical realities. That's
Mm.
finally starting to be rectified, but
Mm.
sometimes it can create aberrations when you're doing studies and doing searches in databases, and most of the charts that are coming up are men. But I'm trying to do my best to offset that here in this episode going forward.
Hmm. Right. It's really tricky when you like just think of people you find interesting personally and you really want to use their charts and their women, but they don't always have, exact birth times. And so you just can't do as much astrologically with the example.
Yeah, exactly. Because if I don't have a birth time, I can't do this sort of study in terms of looking at the rulers of the houses, and then
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's like, what do you do? Do you use the chart of the best example of you that you have?
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes you end up with more men than women, or um, yeah, it's
Yeah.
tricky.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so Madonna, we were going to talk about Madonna. I
Yes.
became obsessed with Madonna. I spent at least a day researching Madonna's life because the more and more I looked into her chart, the more blown away I was at how well the astrology works.
Yes, this was another whole rabbit hole, and you can now do an entire separate episode on Madonna astrology.
I very well could. I know there's many astrologers that are also Madonna fans that would join me for that.
Mm,
But yeah, it became fascinating because I didn't know a lot about her biography. I knew like a little bit. I had
mm,
avoided using her chart in the past because I thought there was more birth time issues. And I know she has public statements out there saying that her birth time is unknown, but it actually seems like there's actually a pretty good source for this time for Virgo rising. So
mm,
this is somewhat tentative, and most of these I've tried really hard to stick with double A birth times, which are birth times where we know it's from a birth certificate or birth record, which additionally restricts, which charts you can use. Because I try to stick to reliable ones. So this one's a little bit more speculative than usual, but I think it works really well. So here's her chart. Madonna was born with Virgo rising, Mercury conjunct the ascendant in Virgo retrograde. Um, and her second house is Libra, and we find Jupiter conjunct the North Node in Libra in her second house in a day chart. So just off the bat, we would expect financial things to do well, and indeed, um, she achieved phenomenal success throughout her career, being referred to at different points as the queen of pop. And she's the best-selling female recording artist of all time and has sold over 300 million records worldwide. So there's a little bit of a discrepancies here because now we've moved over the past 10 years into the age of like streaming. And I think I don't know I don't I think that affects then like those records in terms of who's the highest selling person of all time,
mm,
because people stream stuff now, they don't necessarily buy stuff. So I don't exactly know how that worked out, but at least in terms of the lists, like if you go to Wikipedia or elsewhere for highest selling artists of all time, she is the number one woman at this point.
mhm,
Um, Additionally, she's had many other financial successes and like holds many records, including the first woman to accumulate $1 billion in concert revenue because she was doing just these amazing concert runs in especially the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, so that she was essentially like, nowadays we have Beyonce and Taylor Swift doing that and doing these amazing concert runs and making tons and tons of money. But it's like Madonna was Beyonce or Taylor Swift before
mhm.
all of that, like in the 1980s and 90s.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So her net worth is actually estimated to be around $850 million, making her one of the wealthiest musicians in the world, like, period. Not just because of her success, in terms of music and concerts, but also in terms of being a very smart and savvy businesswoman, in terms of her investments, in terms of other merchandising things that she's gotten into and things like that.
Mm,
So the thing that I thought was interesting for my purposes is that she's said to own over $100 million worth of art, that she's actually an art collector. And that's actually, I think that's the estimate. She may actually own way more than that, but I think that's the baseline, that she owns at least $100 million of worth of art. It may actually be significantly higher than that. So she collects art, and I saw her say in an interview that that paintings are very big indulgences of hers. So Jupiter is in Libra, ruled by Venus, which is in Leo. Um, and she said that early on, before she was super successful, that she kind of promised to herself, or she said that once she made her first $1 million, that she would buy art and paintings.
mm,
So this was like one of her life goals that she then manifested. And just to give you like an idea of what that means, she actually owns a self-portrait by Frida Kahlo, um, which is one of the five paintings that Kahlo painted while she lived in Detroit, titled Self-Portrait with a Monkey. She also owns Frida Kahlo's painting My Birth. And I was blown away when I saw that because those are actually two really famous paintings at this point that like everyone's seen, and she actually owns the originals.
Yeah.
She also owns a painting from Salvador Dali. She owns his The Veiled Heart and just tons and tons of other stuff. So in terms of like planet examples, I thought that was really interesting just in terms of um, Jupiter being there, being super successful financially, and then what one decides to spend their money on, in some instances coming through the nature of the sign and its ruler.
And for her, it's both, how she makes a living is through music, which is another Venus thing, Venus ruling that Libra placement, and then also what she spends her money on as well. And it's interesting, Venus is the ruler of that Jupiter in the second in a day chart. And it's in the 12th, which you would expect to be a little more challenging, at least at certain times in life. But it's nicely mitigated, at least if this exact time is, pretty correct, because it's almost within 3 degrees. Yeah, it's like almost just a hair outside the sextile to the midheavens. That's helping things out.
Oh yeah, no, it's mitigated by the midheaven. I think that's why
Mm-hmm.
it works so well. So, and
Mm-hmm.
that's what I wanted to get into next was Venus, because like once I saw that and I first discovered, how successful she was financially, she was the first woman in 1990. She became the first woman entrepreneur to appear on a Forbes magazine cover on October 1st, 1990.
Mm.
Um, get this, transiting Venus moved into her second house that day and sextiled her natal Venus.
That's funny. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's good.
I thought that was pretty on the nose.
Mm-hmm.
So I was excited by that, but then I started asking the question, like with Lillian Bettencourt, with the previous example, the richest woman in the world owned L'Oreal, but she had issues because the ruler of the second was in the 12th house of enemies and self-undoing. I was like, well, how has that come up for Madonna? Because the initial delineation I had in my head, just doing the basic analysis, of the chart, is that the ruler of the second house of finances is in the 12th house of enemies or self-undoing, and
Mm-hmm.
that Venus also rules the ninth house of religion, philosophy, and foreign travel. And Mars, we find Mars there in a day chart as her most difficult planet, is in the ninth house of religion, philosophy, and foreign travel. And it's overcoming Venus through a superior sign-based square. So I was like, I didn't really know how that worked. And so I started looking through her biography, and then I found this amazing instance of that, which is the Pepsi commercial fiasco of 1989. So are you familiar with this?
Well, I am from talking with you, but I
For
remember
me.
the videos. I definitely remember the videos firsthand.
Okay. Well, the key point is that she um, struck up a deal with Pepsi in 1989 in order to do some commercials, and they were going to pay her $5 million for just this 2-minute commercial featuring her song that hadn't been released yet, Like a Prayer. And they were also going to like sponsor her tour. So it was like this huge deal, and like $5 million in 1989 is equivalent to almost like $12 million, at least in 2024. So this was super big money for the time. It was setting all sorts of records and stuff, and Pepsi put a lot into it. But what's really funny is they didn't watch the music video for the song before it was released. And
Mm.
so Pepsi in 1989 at the Grammy Awards on February 22nd, 1989, they aired like a preview of their commercial. So not even the full commercial, just like a preview of the commercial to like build hype up to this commercial with her that they're about to release. And then early the following month, they released the commercial, which is this cute little 2-minute commercial where it's like going back and forth between like a younger and older version of herself. And it's like a younger version of herself who's like kicking back and enjoying a Pepsi. And she's watching an adult version of herself, like being all successful and being this huge, rock star, basically. So it's a cute, like uncontroversial commercial, and it has snippets of her song, like a prayer in it, before the single had actually come out. So it was actually unique because it was the first time that music from an artist had been used like in a commercial before the release of the actual song,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
But then what happens is that um, the day after the commercial came out, she then dropped the actual music video for the song like a prayer. And the music video had like burning crosses in it, and it had a bunch of religious imagery that a bunch of Christians thought was blasphemous, and it caused this huge like firestorm of controversy amongst Christian groups, including going all the way up to the Pope, John Paul II, who said that it was blasphemous. And yeah, it was actually pretty wild because it created a whole controversy. Christian groups then announced that they were going to boycott Pepsi. And Pepsi got so freaked out that they completely pulled the commercial, but they let her keep the $5 million. So I thought that was interesting because it perfectly ties together the themes here that we're talking about, where it's like you have Jupiter in the second house,
Mm.
$5 million for a commercial,
Mhm.
but then Venus is ruled by the ruling the second. It's placed in the 12th of self-undoing, so it's like she does something that kind of like undoes that deal,
Mhm.
in addition to Mars being in the ninth house, which ironically, like if you read some of the ancient delineations from like Firmicus and Maternus and stuff and other ancient astrologers, they talk about Mars in the ninth house being blasphemous, or
Right.
people that do blasphemy, since the ninth house is the place of religion and God and philosophy and things like that.
Mhm.
Um, but then it still works out for her because Venus is mitigated and it's sextile at the degree of the midheaven. And
Mhm.
she basically ends up getting to keep the $5 million. And if anything, the controversy and the fact that she created all these enemies from these Christian groups, it may have actually helped her sales during that time, because the controversy in some ways helped like promote the music video and the single and everything else. And the
Mhm.
single ended up going on to be wildly successful.
Right, the notoriety kind of fed into the positive things in her chart, surrounding her livelihood, which is funny. Yeah, I remember that happening, and it's also, it was also a bigger deal back then. Like, the fact that it was like, an outrage to Christian groups, this was more of a mainstream reaction back then compared to, like, how it would be now, with, like, her and Sinead O'Connor and some of those people who, really pissed off, like, an Orthodox religion. That was a bigger deal, sort of widespread through society. Wasn't like a
Right.
marginal thing.
Well, and some of it was, bullshit, frankly, because it was like racism tinged with it a little bit, because part of it was like in the video, she has like a black, possibly man, who's either a saint or is actually supposed to be Jesus.
Mm,
And then she's like vaguely, I don't know, caressing him at one point. So it's not clear if there's like sexual undertones. The song itself has some sexual innuendo in it, which is also
mhm,
interesting in terms of Mars being the planet of sex in the ninth house of religion, and how she
mhm,
sometimes intertwines those themes in some of her work. So it's
mhm,
like some of the, yeah, there are a lot of different things going on there in terms of why it was controversial and how much things have changed since then. Actually, it's funny that you mentioned that. So, given mentioning that, the last piece of this I wanted to mention is last year in 2023, um, at the very end of the Venus retrograde in Leo. Remember, her Venus is natally retrograde in Leo, or is natally in Leo as the ruler of her
mhm,
second house, as well as the end of a Mercury retrograde on September 12th, 2023. Madonna and Pepsi later aired the full commercial again at the 2023 MTV Video Music Awards. And it was that Venus retrograde and Mercury retrograde, and she was literally like revisiting the past and revisiting this
mhm,
past controversy, but this time she was kind of like coming out triumphant.
mhm.
So let me show you the transits of that, because the transits are just too perfect.
That's funny. It's funny. And I also want to mention while you're pulling that up, the reception between Venus and Jupiter, is also really helping the fact that it's doing well, even though it's in the 12th.
Totally. That they're exchanging signs at a mutual reception, which creates a sort of,
Not a
or
mutual
not
reception.
not mutual
Yeah, just
reception, just
reception.
one-way
Yeah.
reception, right?
Yeah, but it's reception with the like, the benefic of sect. So,
Yeah, for sure. So these are the transits for September 12th, 2023, when they re-released the commercial. So Mercury is at 8 degrees of Virgo, and it's like a day or two away from stationing direct at 8 degrees of Virgo, right on her ascendant at 8 degrees of Virgo. So this is
nice.
one of the reasons why I think this time is correct. And I don't know
Mm-hmm.
why she's saying her birth time's unknown. This seems like
Mm,
an accurate birth time. I saw a couple other instances of major events in her life lining up with that ascendant degree. So
mm-hmm.
think about it. It's like Mercury retrograde, you're revisiting the past, but Mercury's stationing direct on the ascendant. Then
Right.
look at Venus. This is September 12th. So this is just like a week after Venus stationed direct at 12 degrees of Leo. So remember that last summer, all the Venus retrograde stuff, this turns out to be another example of that. It's stationing direct on her Uranus.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, Jupiter is also stationing at that time, or is close to stationing at that time. And it's right at 15 degrees of Taurus. So it's right on top of
Mm,
her Mars at 15 degrees of Taurus, which was the source of like the issue to begin with, which
right.
was, um, the perception at least that she was committing blasphemy.
Mm-hmm. That's funny. Yeah. Yeah, that lines up perfectly.
And listen to what she said, because it was very like Venus retrograde stationing on her Uranus. So
Mm-hmm.
the new version of the ad that Pepsi released, it ends with a graphic that says celebrating 40 years of disrupting the status quo. And then on Twitter at the time when it was re-released, she said, "So began my illustrious career as an artist, refusing to compromise my artistic integrity. Artists are here to disturb the peace."
Mm, that's
So
great.
yeah, it's that the Venus Uranus, but also Mars like in Taurus and like her artistic integrity. I thought that was just brilliant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That yeah, and that Venus co-present with Uranus ruling the second house of like how she makes a living.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because she was even the religious controversies aside, like she was always like kind of pushing the edge of what was considered like acceptable back then. Even just through sexuality and stuff. Yeah, her other videos were as well.
Right. Yeah. Um, the only other thing with her, just very briefly, is that she has um that Jupiter is ruling the seventh house of marriage and relationships.
Mm,
And she's been married a couple of times, but when she was divorced from the filmmaker Guy Ritchie in 2008, it was reported to be one of the most expensive celebrity divorces in history, with estimates suggesting a settlement between 76 and 92 million dollars. So that's a signature that I kept seeing come up when the ruler of the seventh was in the second, or sometimes when the ruler of the second was in the seventh, that sometimes, especially when it was a more challenging placements, but sometimes even with not, that sometimes there would be like a very costly divorce at some point with some of these different people. So
mm-hmm.
Steven Spielberg is a really great example of that, with the ruler of the second was Saturn in a night chart ruling the seventh, and they had a prenuptial agreement, but it was thrown out by the judge because it was written on a napkin for some bizarre reason.
Okay.
And then that was like one of the most costly celebrity divorces in history. And then Johnny Carson was actually another one of those, who he had Venus. Hold on, let me find it.
Mm. Yeah, it comes up a lot. That connection between the second and the seventh, either way.
Yeah, because it's like if they're connected, it means that somehow the partner's finances are tied in, or that the marriage and relationships are tied in with your finances, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those times, especially when it's poorly placed, it is a challenge that comes up, and one of the most obvious ways that that can manifest is through divorce and through splitting of the assets.
Right, and sometimes it's just, like, a challenging transit coming about, and then that's, like, a one-time thing in the person's life that where they're otherwise doing fine financially.
Yeah, and I've commonly used that as an example because somebody originally challenged me on it with Steven Spielberg, because he
Mhm,
has Cancer rising and he has Saturn conjunct Pluto in the second house in a night chart. So it's supposed to be his most
mhm,
difficult planet, but somebody was like, see, the concept of sect doesn't work because he's a millionaire, he's very rich. So
mm,
obviously Saturn in the second is not giving him problems. But then I looked through his biography and I found this weird incident in the 1980s where he had this bizarre celebrity divorce, and it ended up being the most costly celebrity divorce in history at that time. And
mhm,
Saturn is ruling the seventh house of relationships and the eighth house of other people's money, or specifically like the partner's money.
mhm, right, yeah. His money seems to be coming about maybe, like, through the place of acquisition or something, right?
Yeah.
Showing more of the positives.
Yeah. I mean, there's like multiple other things going on in his chart in terms of that, but
Mhm,
sometimes that's one of the important points in the research, that sometimes these placements can show um, specific events that happen in the life at some point
right,
when they get activated. And sometimes those can be like one-time events, but they
mhm,
still, even though they only happen one time, they're still really important.
right,
Other times it can be an event that happens like two or three times in the life,
mhm.
so that it's not continuous, but the fact that the person has a similar experience archetypally in that area two or three times still becomes very distinctive, especially if it's something that doesn't happen to all people, for example.
Right, that's the tricky thing about the natal chart needing to represent your entire lifetime, is that you also have to use timing on top of that to show kind of like what's happening at different times in your life.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm,
Um, Let me give the Carson example, even though it's obviously a lot, but because it had a transit connection.
mm,
So with Johnny Carson, he had Scorpio rising. He was a talk show host. He was like very, very successful, financially successful talk show host. Taurus is on the seventh house, the place of relationships. It's in the second house of finances. It also rules the 12th house. He was married four times, and his second and third divorces were very costly. So his divorce from his third wife was finalized in 1985, and it was said to be one of the most expensive celebrity divorces at the time, costing Carson an estimated $200 million.
mm,
So this is a nice comparison with Steven Spielberg and Lillian Bettencourt then, because it's again the ruler of the seventh and the second. Um, so they split in 1983, but their divorce settlement wasn't completed until 1985. And later that year, Saturn went into Sagittarius, which is his second house. So I can't find the date for the settlement, but I
mm,
think that's really, notable that Saturn went into the second house, sort of timing that transit, that placement to some extent.
mhm, for sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. I think that's good for planet and houses examples, even though obviously we've gotten into rulers at this point.
Mhm,
We've covered all the planet and house ones.
mhm, sounds good.
All right. Unfortunately, I know it's almost 2 hours. We haven't going for an hour, but I think we should take another short break.
Okay.
If you're really looking to deepen your studies of astrology, then check out my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology. It's perfect for beginner and intermediate students because I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, including monthly webinars and Q&A sessions. And at the end of the course, if you complete the final test, you'll receive a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me. You can find out more information at theastrologyschool.com. All right, we're back from break. So I want to transition at this point. We've finished talking about planets in the second house for the most part. Even though that wasn't comprehensive, it gives you a taste of some of the different ways that can manifest. I want to talk about now the ruler of the ascendant in the second house. So in some previous examples, previous episodes, I've talked about how the ruler of the ascendant can tell you something about the native's overall life direction. because the first house was called the helm in ancient astrology, like the steering wheel of a ship. And then the ruler of the ascendant was kind of like the captain of the ship that would direct you to a specific destination. So sometimes when the ruler of the ascendant is located in a different house, in a specific house in the chart, the topics associated with that house can have some broader impact on the overall direction of the native's life. And that comes up in this instance when the ruler of the ascendant is in the second house. There's something about money and finances that can become more important in terms of the overall life direction than it is for other people.
Right.
So we've already seen that a little bit with Octavia Butler, right?
Right. Yeah. She had the ruler of the ascendant in the second and the ruler second in the first. And it really reinforced that finances were like a primary thing she needed to focus on for better or worse.
Right. And there was like challenges that came with that with Saturn and Pluto there in the second house.
Hmm.
But ultimately, it was like also something that then informed some of the themes in her books and her writings and stuff.
Right. Yeah. And people can have that focus come about through a variety of means. Some people really just like want to make money, for instance, if the ascendant ruler is in the second, but that's not how it works for everyone. For other people, the ascendant ruler in the second will show that finances are like a primary challenge in life, and that's like a big piece of their sort of ongoing biography. Um, yeah, for other people, it shows that they're actually focused on the topic of finances or money, like in whatever they do in the world. So there's different ways that that can play out.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, so this is like the all-time example of this, like the best example. People have been using it for over a century now, but I rediscovered it recently because I had forgotten about it, but it's still like the most amazing example of that. So it turns out that Karl Marx, that we have a birth time for him, and that
Yeah.
he was born with Aquarius rising and Saturn in Pisces in the second whole sign house in a night chart. Um, and basically, Karl Marx has the ruler of the ascendant in the second house. How freaking perfect is that?
No, I love it. I refound that as well a couple of years ago when we were getting ready to do the year ahead when Saturn was going to go into Pisces. So I was looking for Saturn and Pisces people. And that was just, yeah, perfect. Because like his entire life's work was about the financial, finance and labor, basically.
Yeah, that he analyzed the role of money and capital in society, and his primary concerns were social and economic equalities that he observed under capitalism. Um, Preface, I'm not super familiar with the work of Karl Marx. Like I know there's many people that are and are
Mm.
much more well read in this area of philosophy and economics and everything else. So
Hmm.
I'm going to preface that because like I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert in this area and I don't have any strong opinions. But I just think it's an amazing example because we know his is a rare case where we have an example of somebody where we know that the topic of money and finances and possessions, that his life actually had a huge impact on the world, not just in his personal life, where he was focused on that topic in his writings, but also that it ended up having an impact for many millions of people in different countries and on world history in terms of that topic as well.
Right, for sure. And that was a night chart, right?
Yeah, it's a night chart. So that's one of the things that's interesting is he actually struggled financially throughout his life, and that was part of his motivation and sort of insight into what he ended up creating.
Right, for sure. Yeah, and it's kind of like then the focus was like on not just his own problems financially, but like the problems that can go wrong in society with financial arrangements.
Yeah. So here, let me put the chart back up again. Because so first let's look at the chart because there's other things going on with that Saturn. So it's in the second house. It's co-present with Pluto. So we're talking about a
Mm.
Saturn-Pluto conjunction in the second house.
Similar to Octavia Butler.
Okay, that's interesting. And
Hmm.
also just it reminds me of like, when COVID hit, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction is like a large part of what astrologers associate with that conjunction in 2020,
Hmm.
and some of the wild economic things that it did at the time.
Hmm.
So his Saturn's at 15 degrees of Pisces. It's squaring the midheaven, at 13 degrees of Sagittarius, which I think is interesting in the 11th house.
Hmm.
And the ruler then is Jupiter, ruling both the second house of finances and the 11th house of friends, alliances, and groups. And of course, he famously, it was when he got together and had the support of Friedrich Engels.
Hmm.
He did some of his most important work together, was with that as a sort of like alliance.
Hmm. Right.
Um, so Saturn squaring the midheaven, it's also squaring Uranus at 19 degrees of Sagittarius, and it's kind of widely squaring Neptune at 26 degrees of Sagittarius.
Hmm. Right. So speaking to like, the desired change in structures of society around finances, as well as kind of the collectiveness of Neptune being tied into Saturn in the second.
Yeah. And then
And
one thing that I thought was interesting is the ruler of his 10th whole sign house, he has Scorpio on the 10th whole sign house. So
mm,
it's ruled by Mars, the 10th house of career and reputation. And Mars is in the sixth house, which is like traditionally the place of work,
hmm.
those who are subservient to you or subordinate to you. But also more broadly, you could say it's the sixth house is the place of labor.
Yeah,
So it's
right.
like the two most important planets in his chart are like the ruler of the ascendant, which is in the place of money and finances and possessions, and the ruler
Hmm.
of the 10th, which is in the place of labor.
Yeah, it's perfect. And then those are trying each other. So it's just like this was the focus of his life's work. Something that I really loved in addition to that in terms of literal astrology, because I love literal astrology, is um a big piece of his work was about the alienation of labor. And again, I am also not a Karl Marx expert, but I know that this was like a big piece was the alienation of labor and the alienation from the means of production and things like that. And I just thought that was so good with he has, the ruler of the second in the 12th house, right?
Mm,
And so, which certainly sounds like that. And then Mars is in Cancer, so it's like opposite the sign that it's exalted in, right? So it's in its fall. And just yeah, sometimes like just the alienation of being like in the farthest place it could be from the place it's happiest in.
right.
And then that's in the sixth house of labor, which is like perfect.
Yeah, definitely. He was also born the day of a solar eclipse in Taurus, which is also relevant. Let me read you some of the notes I wrote that are relevant. So it says, Marx lived much of his life in poverty, so Saturn in the second house in a night chart, often relying on financial support from friends and family, most notably Friedrich Engels, so Jupiter ruling both the second house and the 11th house.
Mm,
His focus was on his intellectual work, writing extensively on philosophy, economics, and politics. He dedicated his life to understanding and critiquing the capitalist system with the ultimate goal of advocating for a more equitable society. Therefore, while Marx's work explored the complexities of money and its impact on society, his personal life was not driven by a desire for material wealth. He spent most of his adult life in London, living in poverty and struggling to support his family. And yeah, he wrote very widely, but his primary focus was on understanding and critiquing the capitalist economic system.
hmm. Right. That's a great chart.
Yeah, so there's a lot more we could go into and say about that, and but I just in terms of that general point of like when we say sometimes like the ruler of the ascendant can tell you that a person's life in some instances can be more directed towards a specific topic compared to other people,
Hmm.
that is probably the most extreme example that we could come up with.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let's look at some other examples of ruler of the ascendant in the second house. Okay, so
Yeah,
another,
that one. Yeah.
yeah, that would be a
Mm.
good one. Okay, so another one that I found when I was doing this research is Mackenzie Scott, who was the former wife of Amazon.com founder Jeff Bezos. And what happened is like a few years ago, Mackenzie Scott was in the news because when she divorced Jeff Bezos, when they got a divorce, she walked away with like billions of dollars, which she then started donating like extremely rapidly. And her chart
Mhm.
is fascinating because she was born with Aries rising, and the ruler of the ascendant is Mars, which is located in Taurus in the second whole sign house, along with a whole stellium of other planets in Taurus, which includes Mercury, Venus, the moon, Saturn, and then, of course, Mars, all in the second house.
Right. So this is someone who's just like a huge, huge focus on finances.
Yeah. So to put it in context, so they divorced in 2019. It was not like one of the most costly celebrity divorces,
Mm.
literally the most costly celebrity divorce in history.
Mm.
And the settlement was estimated to be $38 billion. So it's like, remember we were talking
Wow.
about some of those other like movie stars, and it was like,
Hmm.
20 billion, $20 million was high for Carson at the time,
Hmm.
or Madonna, it was like 50 to 75 or something like that, like 100 million, maybe even tops. This is
Hmm.
$38 billion.
Yeah.
So, as a result of that, Mackenzie Scott came out of her divorce as the third wealthiest woman in the United States and the 47th wealthiest individual in the entire world. So, later in 2020, the stock price of Amazon went up. And for a period in 2020, she actually became the wealthiest woman in the world. But what's interesting about it is that after the divorce, she became a major philanthropist and she just started giving away tons and tons of money, like billions and billions of dollars,
Hmm.
so that she gave away so much money that she stopped being the richest woman in the world
Hmm.
and she pledged to give away at least half of her wealth.
Yeah, it's really impressive. And one of the things I found interesting about the transits is that Uranus was like at the end of Aries slash beginning of Taurus, like
Hmm.
um, around the beginning of all this happening. And
Oh, yeah,
so
that's a great point.
what we've seen is like Uranus going over all of those many Taurus placements and that rapidly changing what she's doing with her finances.
That's
And
a great point.
yeah, and in some ways doing something that's considered very, very unusual, right? Because even like most very wealthy people don't give away as much as like she's been giving away. Um, yeah, so it's really activating all of that. Something else I love about this stellium is, you see that this is this is a day chart, and she does have Mars ruling the ascendant in the second, along with all those other placements. And
Mhm.
normally, when you see Mars in the second, like in a lot of these other
Oh,
examples, we've
yeah.
seen like spending a lot, right?
That's so fun. That's so funny. Yeah,
It
because
is.
like with like Johnny Depp, who I mentioned I didn't show his chart earlier, he's spent so much so extravagantly that he's depleted most of his wealth. But you're right.
Hmm.
She's done the same thing, except like she's doing it mostly to like charities.
Right. And it's like Mars is like spending a lot, but that Mars actually, I was looking at like what it's applying to. And once it hits the sign boundary, it is kind of opposite Neptune. Right? It's like what, 8 degrees applying.
Mhm.
And Mars Neptune is like, you know, efforts that are selfless sometimes. Like sometimes people will do like humanitarian stuff with Mars
Right.
Neptune. Certainly there's other manifestations as well, but that's like one primary one. So anyway, yeah, like funny, like she's spending a lot, but in laudable ways, right?
Yeah, well, so I'm looking at some of this stuff in, just to give you an idea, in a July 2020 Medium post, Scott announced that she had donated $1.7 billion to 116 nonprofit organizations with a focus on racial equality, LGBTQ plus equality, democracy, and climate change. Then in December 2020, less than 6 months later, Scott stated that she had donated a further 4.15 billion to the previous 4 months to 384 organizations with a focus on providing support to people affected by the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and addressing long-term systemic inequities. Um,
Mhm.
in 2020, her charitable giving totaled 5.8 billion, one of the largest annual distributions by a private individual to working charities.
Mhm.
Um, there's so much stuff, like it goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
You mentioned, I mean, it's funny because you mentioned Mars, but it's like Mars is also ruling the eighth house, which is like
Hmm.
the partner's money. It's like she's spending
Or joint. Joint finances.
Yeah, joint finance. And that's kind of an argument because it's like
Yeah.
she was there from the very beginning. She helped him to
Mhm.
found the company of
Company. Yeah.
Amazon. She worked there very early on. So there's other instances where somebody comes in like later in a person's life, after they've made all their money, and then there's a divorce and then it
Mhm.
gets murky. But this is really like she was there from the very beginning.
Right, like, even the ruler of our 4th is in the, 2nd and, applying to conjoin Saturn, the ruler of the 10th house of career, and, like, they literally founded the company in their garage, like, in their new home's
Mhm.
garage. So, yeah, it was definitely joint finances,
And Jupiter's
yeah.
also in the eighth house in her chart.
Right, in a day chart. So that's like the best placement, but she also has like Venus in its own sign in the second and the moon
Mm,
exalted in Taurus in the second. So there's really positive placements in both of the financial houses. And I found this quote from an announcement about her commitment to giving away lots of her money. And
mm.
she wrote, "We each come by the gifts we have to offer, by an infinite series of influences and lucky breaks we can never fully understand." And then she went on to say that one of hers was financial, and that's why she was, giving it away to other people.
That's really funny because I wasn't I don't have it in the chart. Maybe I should put it in the charts, but her lot of fortunes in
I
Taurus.
know. I know, I know. And so it's not only like another marker, yet another marker for the second house being really important to her life, but her lot of fortune then is literally in hard aspect to both benefics. So that's what was actually really speaking to me about that quote.
Right.
She has both the benefics in the two financial houses, and they're both aligned with a lot of fortune, denoting something about your circumstance, additionally.
Yeah. And I did a whole episode about the lot of fortune and how important that is, especially in terms of circumstances that are like outside of your control, or
Mhm.
the element of fortune or chance or luck that plays in terms of where it falls in the birth chart.
Right, right, right. So yeah, all of that is really just fascinating about her chart. And just one last note that I had about her ascendant ruler, saying that it's applying to Neptune, which it is within 8 degrees. And I think that is part of the selfless thing, but it's also applying. Oh, no, that's okay. No, never mind. That's all I wanted to say about that one.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, so that's a really stunning example. And there's also a whole element about transparency and stuff that came up, but
Mm,
I think that's good for her. I think we can move on.
okay.
So yeah, ruler of the ascendant in the second house, and then literally, obviously, giving away and donating so much through charities and philanthropy. That's like you can see why a major part of this person's life then is surrounding financial issues. And obviously, maybe you could already say that since there's like a second house stellium, so it's less
Mhm,
impressive because it's like also the ruler of the ascendant is there, but
mhm.
nonetheless, still interesting.
Well, it shows because she's obviously such an extreme example right now of, financial things being a major focus of her life. And so I
Mhm.
think it is actually like a great example or illustration of both having a major stellium in the second and her ascendant ruler being there. And that's why she's such an extreme example of this.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so that was a good example. Let's switch to like, because then once I do like a good example of somebody doing good
Mhm.
stuff with theirs, then I can switch to like a not great example. So this is
Okay.
one I found where it turned out we had a birth time for this guy named Dan Bilzerian, and
Mm,
he was born with Libra rising and Venus in Scorpio conjunct Uranus in the second whole sign house. And this is a guy that he became popular like a decade ago, where he was claiming that he had made millions and millions of dollars playing poker. Like he was claiming that he had made, I think, $50 million playing private poker games or something like that. And
mm,
then he became famous on Instagram for having just like millions and millions of followers because he would have these just ostentatious displays of his wealth, and as well as his lifestyle. And it was very like Venus conjunct Uranus in Scorpio, where it was like he was non-monogamous and he'd have like dozens of women around him all the time. And he claimed to be like sleeping with like 10 different women at the same time over multiple year periods. while also living in these huge mansions and doing all of this like crazy extravagant stuff. And he's one of the instances where I felt like lifestyle really did become relevant. And it reminded me a lot of the chart of the Egyptian king, who it wasn't the ruler of the ascendant in his instance, but it was like Libra rising, Scorpio placements in the second house. And just you could tell there was this similar orientation towards like material things as like a major focus of the life.
Right. Yeah, definitely a Senate ruler in the second as a major focus. And then also funny that Jupiter in a night chart is on the ascendant, because that's sometimes the sort of shadow side of Jupiter, then, which is just like, greed or just like taking things too far.
Yeah, with Jupiter on the ascendant and also like
Hmm.
Saturn's there in a night chart. Well, what's
Hmm.
interesting about that is like there's a further um so it's like so gambling um is a major thing with the fourth house. So he
You mean the fifth?
sorry, the second house, at least for
Hmm.
him, like
Hmm.
the focus on poker basically
Mm.
was his main thing, and he continues to play poker. But what's interesting as a complication about his example is a lot of people speculate because he just shows up with like $50 million out of nowhere and he claims that he made it playing poker privately
Mm.
against like really rich people. But a lot of people have looked at his games and asked like whether he's good enough to have actually won that much.
Mm.
And when people have looked into his background, like some of the speculation, if you go to his Wikipedia page, is his father actually, it turns out, was like a corporate what do they call it, like raider in the 1980s who would go in and do like hostile takeovers of companies and
Mm.
make just like millions and millions of dollars through that.
Hmm.
But then he got in trouble basically, and the FBI raided his home, and he was arrested and went to prison for more than a year. And then also received some really harsh financial penalties where the government tried to get a bunch of the money back that he had made because he had made something like at least $60 million supposedly. But then the government was never able to recoup all of the money.
Hmm.
And then all of a sudden, a few decades later, his son comes out of nowhere with like millions of dollars that he says that he got from playing poker. And
Hmm.
so it's been this like open question that people have wondered if a lot of his initial wealth at least came from his father. And I thought that was really fascinating in this instance because if you look at Venus, we have the ruler of the ascendant is Venus in the second house in a night chart. So the most positive planet in the charts, the second house of financial success, but it's in Scorpio and it's ruled by Mars, which
Hmm.
is over in Capricorn, conjunct the IC in the fourth house of the family, the parents, and the father. So it's
Right.
like,
And then there's reception between Venus and Mars. So,
right, they're sextile each other closely while
hmm,
Venus is in. So it's like
Mars
there's
is
this
out.
really interesting connection between finances and the father in the chart itself. And
Hmm.
it's interesting that at the very least that people speculate about whether some of his initial wealth came from his father.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
funny when you can see those things show up astrologically. You're like, well, there's some potential credence here, right?
Yeah, at the very least, you can see why the rumor would start there.
Mm.
But who knows?
Hmm.
So that was interesting, and also just to focus on the material realm, and it's in Scorpio, so it's possible that some of the things with like sex and other things come up there, but there's like some other elements there between him and the Egyptian king in terms of like ensconcing one in the material realm or going to the
Hmm.
fullest extent in terms of material pleasures that I think is
Hmm.
is relevant somehow.
Right.
And I'm not fully there in terms of articulating that, but I think if one was to
Hmm.
try to, these would be two examples up there to give you like a pointer towards, what that's about.
Right. And it's interesting that both of them have a planet that's not happy in Scorpio in the second house. Like maybe that's a part of that commonality.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that was actually interesting about him is I saw some interviews with him when I was trying to research this and understand the placement, where he said that he'd gone to the utmost extreme and height of essentially like physical pleasures and stuff, but
Hmm.
then he ultimately found that it wasn't fulfilling. and that it didn't actually like fulfill him in the way that he thought he would, even if he had fun or enjoyed it or what have you, but that it wasn't
Mhm.
something that he could maintain or wasn't as worth it in terms of staying there.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I don't know where he's at with that now, but I just thought it was really interesting because the keyword for him seemed to be hedonism,
Mhm. Sure.
um, which centered on like glorifying pleasure seeking and indulgence and the pursuit of gratification, essentially.
Totally. Yep.
Yeah. All right. So that is that example.
Mhm.
There's more there, but we will skip it so we can move on for now.
Mhm. Can I talk about Jim Baker?
Yeah, that would be a good one.
Great. This was when I found Jim Baker was a televangelist, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker back in the what 80s, 90s ish. They're still, yeah, most famous back then. So Jim Baker had Pisces rising, Jupiter ruling the ascendant, placed in the second house in Aries in a day chart. So that alone would say there's a particular focus on making a living, raising money, and especially through self-initiating actions with the placement in Aries and Jupiter in a day chart saying that's probably going to be relatively successful for him, right? And indeed it was. They were famous televangelists and raised tons of money for a while. Um, but you can see this Mars. So Mars is ruling that Jupiter. Mars is ruling both the second house of income and the ninth house of religion. And it's placed in the first house of self. And so that, right, those two topics become very primary to him. He's got the ruler of the first and second and first. But Mars is also ruling the ninth, tying in the topic of religion. And that Mars in a day chart is the more problematic Mars, right? And it's applying very closely to conjoin that Jupiter. So there's both like positive abundance indicated as well as like some major problem at some point. And so his story was basically that they did raise lots of money for a while and lived well on it. And then he was convicted of financial fraud at some point. And so there's the Mars coming in. And so it's another one of those examples where excuse me, you see, both of those planets coming into play at some point in life, even though it's like extremes of positive and extremes of negative. And kind
Right.
of like that Mars again of like acquisitiveness, right? I mean, Mars and Jupiter can do that in different ways, but if it were just the Jupiter in a day chart, I might expect this to play out differently in terms of just more of the positive. But it was like the Mars problems coming into play as well. And if I can find that in our outline, there was some timing thing. Here we go. So he was indicted October 4th, 1988 on mail and wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the public. And Mars was retrograde and it was about to conjoin his ascendant ruler Jupiter in the second house during a first house perfection year in which that Jupiter would have been the Lord of the year. And so things happening with to or from Jupiter would have been more important that year. And that retrograde Mars by transit was about to conjoin that when he was indicted. It's really
Wow.
perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, those retrogrades are super, super important. I'll give another example of that in a minute, but
Hmm.
especially, if it's a negative one, it can be a negative event like taking money away or having a financial challenge.
Hmm. Right. And only one other side note I wanted to mention just because it was funny, and I like astrology that amuses me. So he was originally a prosperity theology preacher, which you can imagine, right? With Jupiter ruling the ascendant placed in the second house. It's like, if you're faithful and believe, a financial prosperity will come to you. But then at some point later, like after these things happened, he turned into like sort of an Armageddon, like apocalyptic theology and became sort of like a prepper and was like selling prepper type things. And that's really funny to me because the Jupiter is obviously like the prosperity theology piece, but then Mars is ruling the ninth house in a day chart. And so at some point that kicked in and you became, it was like the fire and brimstone religious orientation took over, which is just
Right.
being literal.
Yeah, that's very literal.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing we found with a lot of these is a lot of them are just like surprisingly literal.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. All
So
right.
I like that
That's
one.
good.
Yeah.
That's a good one. All right. Where are we? Let me switch back. Is that Maybe I should do a positive. I need a positive one first, but set it to set
Okay.
up some of the other ones. Oh yeah, no, you just mentioned second house, a retrograde, and the second house and a bad one. I have a positive one that'll actually be a positive counter example, which I used last summer and I was really impressed by, which is Margot Robbie
Hmm.
when Barbie came out. Um, Barbie came out as this huge sensation last summer, the summer of 2023,
Mm.
and Barbie was released right as Venus was stationing retrograde in Leo, and then it just went on to do this huge run where it made like $1.5 billion or something like that worldwide, becoming, I think, the most successful movie last year. And we actually have a time chart for Margot Robbie, and she has Cancer rising with Jupiter, the Sun, and Mercury in Cancer in the first house, the first whole sign house. And then her second house is Leo. And that was what was really curious is like, she was the star of the movie and her reputation was obviously very good at that time. So there's this question of like, well, why is it in her second house? Why is the Venus retrograde there when it's
Mm.
obviously it turned out that the Venus retrograde in Leo didn't just coincide with the release of the movie, but when I took it back, like Barbie's history kept coinciding with Venus retrogrades in Leo, going back to the first summer that it was released during a Venus retrograde in Leo. But it was in her second house, and then I came to understand why that was. And it's because she wasn't just the star of the movie, but she was actually the one that came up with the idea to do the movie. And she was the one that pitched it in the first place to the production studios.
Mm. Hmm.
Um, she was the one that pitched it to the production studios because she had started a production company.
Hmm.
So when she pitched it to the studios, she flat out said during her pitch meetings that she believed a Barbie movie could bring in $1 billion dollars at the worldwide box office, which turned out to be true. And it ended up being the biggest debut ever for a film directed by a woman. But what's interesting about this is, it was in her second house. So the reason why that's important is because since she was the production company that produced the movie, it meant a lot of that income then came back to her. So this is also not just her starring in it and her reputation going up, but it was also a huge financial windfall for her because of how financially successful it was. And that's
Hmm.
why the Venus retrograde in Leo was sort of activating her second house at that time.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great example of that.
Yeah. So that's a positive to sort of counterbalance thing, a positive example of that. Jupiter was also transiting her midheaven at the time. So that was
Hmm.
the other positive, like reputation piece. But
Hmm.
yeah, Venus retrograde in Leo in the second house, and the second house transits, positive ones, sometimes indicating huge windfalls or indicating things being hugely financially successful that you've worked on or set out to do.
Right, for sure.
Yeah. All right. So let me get back to my ruler of the ascendant ones. Let's switch back to other guys. So this one was funny to me. So this is the birth chart of Dana White, who's like one of the people basically that created the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, or he's the one that led it to what it is today, where like mixed martial arts and all of that is so popular.
Mm.
He basically part of his story is Scorpio rising and Mars ruling the ascendant, and it's placed in Sagittarius in the second house. It has some interesting configurations to a bunch of different planets in his chart, but the main thing is just Mars in the second house, and he's made millions and millions of dollars off of being like the president of this fighting company, literally.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, that's really funny. Again, literal astrology is fun. Um, and, it's funny too, sometimes obviously he has mitigations too, to that Mars, because this is a day chart, so you would expect it to be, sometimes, like, problematic, and maybe it has been at certain points or something in his life, but, he has that nice Jupiter sextile overcoming Mars and such. But it's also funny in that, sometimes I don't think this always works, but sometimes in a kind of remediation sense, like when someone does something very appropriate to the nature of that placement, I think it kind of takes that energy a bit instead of it being like solely problematic for his finances. It's like, no, he's, profiting, through the topic of fighting, which is like more of a day chart Mars.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and it's like he's famously gotten in like fights with different people. Um, the ruler of the second is Jupiter, which is in the 12th, which is kind of interesting because he's
Mm.
had a lot of very public fights with sometimes like fighters who
Mm.
are, connected with him, sometimes due to issues over pay or them complaining about not being paid enough,
Hmm.
like adequate wages or different things like that.
Mm.
So it's interesting how that comes into play. Um, and yeah, but there's actually a lot of things we could go into, but he's
Hmm.
worth $500 million supposedly in 2019, so it's probably more
Mm.
now, although
Hmm.
he denies being a billionaire. But
Mm.
his life has been significantly directed towards making money through fighting and through
Yeah.
being a fighting promoter
Hmm.
by and promoting and managing the business side of combat sports.
Right. Yep. Makes sense.
Pretty literal, pretty
Yep. Pretty,
straightforward.
pretty literal.
Okay. I want to do just two more examples of the ruler of the ascendant, and then we'll move on to the rulers of the houses. All right. First example, Arnold Palmer, who was a famous golfer, starting, I think, in like the 1950s, in the middle of the 20th century. And he had Virgo rising with Mercury in Libra in the second whole sign house conjunct Mars. It's probably a night chart because the sun is just a little bit below um,
Hmm.
the
Yep.
horizon. Usually, if it's like 6 degrees, that sometimes can be like a day chart, like in the case of George Lucas. But this guy's on the border. I actually don't have a strong opinion about whether it's day or night. It
Mm.
doesn't necessarily matter. But he was a famous golfer, and he was the first golfer to reach $1 million in career earnings. So I thought that was amazing. So Wikipedia says he's an American professional golfer, is widely regarded as one of the greatest and most charismatic players in the sport's history. Um, his influence on golf is immeasurable. He transformed the sport into a mainstream spectacle, attracting millions of fans with his thrilling play and magnetic personality. But what's interesting, achieving the milestone of $1 million in career earnings in 1968 was a significant event in golf history for several reasons. One, the financial impact on the sport, because it highlighted the growing financial potential of professional golf. Before Palmer, the sport was not known for generating substantial wealth for players, but his success demonstrated that golfers could achieve significant financial rewards through prize money and through endorsements, inspiring many others to pursue a professional golf career in that sport. So it's like this guy's the reason why people later, like Tiger Woods, could have these huge endorsements with like, Nike and different
Mm.
companies like that, is because this guy was kind of like a trailblazer.
Hmm.
So he attracted a very large fan base through his popularity, which helped to boost the television ratings and the attendance at golf tournaments. And he sort of became the symbol for a new era because by reaching the $1 million mark, he solidified his status as one of the game's all-time greats and marked a beginning of a new professional era for golf and inspired future generations. So I just thought that was a really striking example. I'm not like a huge golf guy, but it's fascinating seeing these different areas and seeing somebody, where hitting that financial goal or that having that as a turning point in his sport that set a new era for people and seeing his ruler of the ascendant there was so
Hmm.
striking. And then, of course, he was also very smart with marketing. And there was that drink that was named after him, the Arnold
Mm.
Palmer, which is
All
like
right.
a mix of like half tea and half lemonade. And he
Mm-hmm.
actually ended up licensing his name out to the
Mm.
Arizona Tea Company in like 2001. So now that they actually produce that drink and it's sold in stores all over America with his name on it. So
That's
he was
funny.
very savvy as like a licensor as well.
That's funny too, as like a literal manifestation of like you yourself being like a part of a product, right? Like with the Ascendant ruler in the second.
Oh my God, I just thought of something I didn't think of until you said that.
Mm.
It's in Libra and the drink is
Yeah.
literally half iced tea and half lemonade. It's half
That's
and
true. That's
half.
a good
And
point.
that's the alternative name for it is
That's
half and half. And Libra is the
yeah,
scales
yeah.
and is commonly joked about that sometimes heavy Libra placements have a hard time deciding
Between
between
two
two
things.
things.
Yeah.
Half and half.
That's
That's
really funny.
amazing.
Yeah.
Oh my God. And he's known, and that's the thing he's known for. I mean, most people today,
Right.
if you're not a golfer, the reason you've heard
Mm-hmm.
his name is because of the drink. So
Right, right,
this is the chart for the guy, and he's named after a drink, or the drink's named after him, and he is the ruler of the ascendant in the second house, the place of material things, and apparently in
right,
his instance, drinks.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know
Funny.
if Neptune in the first house is relevant as well, but anyways,
Oh, yeah,
good
I'm sure.
good
Liquids.
times, good
Yeah,
times, liquids.
liquids.
All right, we're finding stuff. See, we just find stuff like as you sometimes you that's a real experience I had that was reignited with this is sometimes you pull up a celebrity chart if you don't know anything about them. You look at the chart, you see the placements, but you're like, how does that work out? Like I don't know
Mm-hmm.
how that combination works out. And then you start reading their biography and it starts coming alive and you start realizing how their placements have worked out in very literal ways.
Mm-hmm.
And then it just becomes this amazing thing. I kept calling you every day and or we kept talking excitedly every time I'd find a new chart about just how um it's like a dopamine rush an astrologer gets when they find a new chart and
Right.
they see how well it matches the life.
If anyone wants to come up with a new catchphrase for that, yeah, feel free to brainstorm here.
Yeah, we were trying to come up with a name for that, like a hashtag like astrologer good was the old hashtag for something else. But
Mm-hmm.
then there was another we were trying to come up with a name for, right? Which is like when
Yeah.
you revisit an old chart that you've used before and you rediscover something new about it that you didn't understand previously. I had a
Mm-hmm.
few charts in this collection that were like that.
Totally. Yeah. So we need some good new hashtags for these phenomena.
Yeah, let us know in the comments below on YouTube. All right, so Arnold Palmer. And the other one I have, I guess I'll end with this one, and I'll just mention others as without showing charts and passing their names. But one last one I wanted to mention is the astrologer Noel Till.
Mm.
So he was supposed to be born with Cancer rising, and the moon is the ruler of the ascendant in the second house in Leo.
Mm-hmm.
And um, the degree of the IC is at 7 degrees of Virgo. So in like Placidus and quadrant houses, his moon's in the third house, but in whole sign houses, it's in the second house. And I found this old interview with him where he was describing in like the 1970s or something when he first discovered astrology. He was sitting on his couch or something. He was watching TV one day, and an astrologer came on, and they were trying to explain it. And at some point after they were done, he turned to his wife and he exclaimed, he said, I'm going to write a book. He's like, he said something like, these people aren't explaining this very well, but I'm going to write a book about it that explains it better and I'm going to make $1 million. And I always thought it was so funny that on the one hand, with the ruler of the ascendant in the second house, that part of his motivation was like making $1 million was his
Mm-hmm.
stated thing, which I think he probably did end up doing because he ended up writing a ton of books and selling a lot of courses. And he was a very savvy business person for an astrologer, especially at that time period in the 1990s and 2000s. But then, of course, from his perspective, the ruler of the ascendant was in the third house, according to quadrant houses, and he did write a bunch of books.
Mm-hmm.
So I've not worked this out, but it's just something I'm interested in exploring in. And I know different astrologers are also interested in exploring in terms of what the possible reconciliation is between whole sign houses and quadrant houses. And
Mm-hmm.
if you can use different house systems at the same time, and they either have overlapping meanings or show you different things.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have that worked out yet. And I haven't
Mm-hmm.
seen anybody that fully has it worked out completely. I'm primarily, obviously, we're using whole sign houses for this, and I think that is the foundation of the houses and is the most important like baseline to start from. But occasionally you do see little hints like that, where there
Mm-hmm.
could be points of reconciliation, potentially, and that could be the way forward.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Right. Well, and part of also, I mean, as an aside, also how he made his living was like he had a he had a gigantic presence. I mean, he was not just literally physically very tall. He was like a very tall man. He had a booming voice. He was theatrical. He used to be an opera singer before he was an astrologer, if I'm remembering that right, I think. And
Right.
it's just very like the ascendant ruler in Leo was like part of he did write a bunch of books, but also like how he made his living was being very like not like a performer, but like very very out there in front of people, you know?
Mm,
Yeah.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, and also teaching astrologers how to like do astrology. Yeah, I don't know. There's something there, but
Mm,
anyway,
mm,
that I think will be the the other like ruler of the ascendant in the second was like Chris Jenner, David Beckham, who was like a soccer example to go with Arnold Palmer, golf example, Doja Cat, and yeah, that's it for rulers of the ascendant in the second house.
okay. Good
Cool.
collection.
Thank you. All right, let's take a little break.
Okay.
If you're a fan of the podcast and you'd like to support the production of future episodes, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to a bunch of benefits such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend live recordings, access to the monthly electional astrology podcast, access to another exclusive podcast called the Secret Astrology Podcast that's only available to patrons, or even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. All right, we're back from break. Let's start the final section of this where we're going to talk about the ruler of the second house in different houses and the rulers of other houses in the second house. We're going to go through this section more quickly because both of us are running out of energy and steam, and we'll see if we can get through all 12 houses sequentially. I may jump around a little bit. Let's see how it goes.
Okay.
So, one proviso, these are not comprehensive. These are just some of the meanings associated with those houses in order to give you a sense of different ways that it can manifest. But it's not going to be comprehensive because there's going to be different positive or negative manifestations of each house that obviously due to time we're going to have to leave out.
Yes, for sure.
All right, cool. So let's start with the first one, who is the writer, famous writer, English author Jane Austen, who wrote Pride and Prejudice and a number of other famous works. This one's interesting. I almost use this for just a placement in the house because she has Virgo rising, Moon and Saturn in Libra in the second house in the night chart, and then the ruler of the second house is Venus in the third house of communication. And she did make some writing from her, she did make some money from her writings, but still struggled financially most of her life and had to live with her family basically with Saturn and the moon there in the second house.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. And then the second house ruler being Venus, which is the benefic of sect in the third house of writing and books and so forth,
Yeah,
the source
exactly.
of her income.
So we'll see that a lot, especially writing coming up in communication with the third house with different examples.
Mm.
Um, but so she was considered one of the greatest English novelists. But it's interesting in terms of the themes with Saturn and Libra in the second by night. According to Wikipedia, her plots often explore the dependence of women on marriage for the pursuit of favorable social standing and economic security. Um, Elsewhere,
Mm-hmm.
it says her heroines navigate a world where their choices are limited and their futures often hinge on securing a suitable match. While her stories may involve romance, they also offer a sharp critique of the patriarchal system that restricted women's opportunities and forced them to rely on marriage for their livelihood.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that amazing for like Saturn, Moon in the second house ruled by Venus?
Absolutely. Right. And, that was surely part of many, maybe most women's experiences at the time, but this just because she was an author, became part of like the livelihood that she made, like those themes went into the books. Things about social status in particular in marriage. And it's also interesting that she has both the moon in the second and the ruler is Venus, and those are two planets that are, widely associated with women in general by signification. And her protagonists are largely women, and that's not actually a given for all female authors, right? And so that just like as a basic thing, as part of her, means of livelihood, also kind of intrigued me, as well as Venus being in Scorpio, a sign that is, opposite its rulership. And um, one of the things about some of her characters are like women trying to, move beyond the constraints of like traditional female expectations for the time. And even if it wasn't like, wouldn't be like considered as radical now, it was more so, some of those things, those attributes then. And I feel like that's a perfect like Venus and Scorpio kind of thing of like opposite the rulership of Venus and it being something about doing something different than the status quo in terms of expectations that were gendered at the time.
Yeah, for sure. She also has a close Mars Pluto conjunction that's like squaring that Saturn, and you can feel some of the tensions.
Mm,
Um, but she lived in the 1700s and early 1800s, like the early 19th century. She died in 1817, but she did make money through her writing, but not substantial amount by today's standards. Um, but while it was a decent sum for a woman in her lifetime, it was not enough to live on independently. So she relied on financial support of her family for most of her life. And a lot of her fame and fortune grew after her death. So it's an
mm.
example I may have to come back to when I do that episode on posthumous astrology, which is like how people's charts keep working after they die.
There are like Jane Austen literary societies, and she was the ruler of the 11th and the second.
Oh wow,
Yeah,
that's
I
amazing.
just came across this. Yeah,
Yeah, that's amazing.
yeah,
All right, cool. So we could sit with that one for a while, but let's move
yeah.
on for the sake of getting through everything. So,
Yes.
all right, another one I wanted to mention really quickly is Linda Goodman.
Hmm.
So there's the chart. Can you see the chart?
Now I can, yeah.
Okay, so Linda Goodman um, has Mercury. I was going to actually originally just use this as a planet example, but it was just that Linda Goodman has Mercury in the second house. In her chart, it's actually stationary. It's stationed only a day before stationing retrograde. And Linda Goodman, she did writing and communication to like earn a living for her life. She worked in radio, then writing for newspapers, then even a speech writer. But then eventually she got into astrology and she published a book titled Sun Signs, which became a New York Times bestseller. And her second astrology book, which was titled Love Signs, set an industry record with a record $2.3 million being paid for the paperback rights of the book. And I thought that was really amazing because as an astrologer, she wrote in modern times, one of the most highest selling astrology books of all time, but also was paid like way, way more than any astrologers usually get paid for her book.
Oh, right, totally. Yep.
Yeah. All right. So that is that example. Moving on. Another one, this is just in passing, but just to drive home the previous point. This is Dave Roel. He was an astrologer that passed away, almost a decade ago now, but he was a bookseller.
Hmm.
He had a very famous sort of like publishing house, which I've often, he had Gemini rising and the ruler of the ascendant is Mercury in Aquarius conjunct the midheaven. So you get these ninth house and 10th house themes of being an astrologer and a publisher,
Hmm.
but also with Cancer on the second house and the ruler is the moon, which is in Leo in the third whole sign house. And he made money from books, basically from selling books.
Hmm. Yep, pretty literal.
Sell, selling people's writings.
Hmm.
Okay, so moving on. One last one is Ronan Farrow, who has Aquarius rising, Pisces on the second house, and the ruler is Jupiter in the third house in Aries. And
Mm.
he's a journalist, and he's known for some of his writings, basically, especially his investigative journalist pieces.
Yeah, I love that because it's kind of like the intrepid writing and the investigation with Mercury ruling that in Scorpio in the 10th conjunct Pluto, like that's the type of writing he made his living has made his living from.
Right, which I mean, some of his investigative pieces like kind of blew up in things during the Me Too movement and
Hmm.
just some abuses that were occurring in Hollywood.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And like
All
he's
right.
the one, like it being in Aries is like he's just kind of going off doing this on his own, you know?
Right. Yeah,
Like it's a
exactly.
very independent thing.
Definitely. All right, moving on to the fourth house. Maurizio Gucci, probably mispronouncing, but I've used him commonly as a example because I love the mutual reception. He has Cancer rising, night chart with Venus conjunct Pluto in the second whole sign house. And then the ruler of the second house is the sun, which is in Libra in the fourth house of
Hmm.
parents. And then the fourth house is Libra, so it's ruled by Venus, which is in the second house of finances. He was the grandson of the Gucci fashion empire. And in the 1980s, when his father died, he inherited essentially most of the company, which was
Hmm.
worth just millions and millions and millions of dollars. So I always thought that was a really great example, just showing the tight connection between the second house and the fourth house and inheriting a bunch of money from a fashion empire from your family, which is very like Libra and Leo coded.
Totally. Yeah, usually when the second house is tied up with either the fourth or the eighth, and there's like inherited money. Um, yeah.
Exactly. And not to make any explicit comments, but to come back to another chart again that we talked about earlier, here's
Right.
Dan Bilzerian's chart where we had that
Yep.
question where he had Scorpio on the second house and the ruler is Mars, which is in the fourth house. And just a
Hmm.
question, it's like, did he inherit any money from his father or did
I'm
it
sure he did. I'm
did
sure he did just
well
by
no, we
some of
don't know because we don't want to get sued.
Okay,
And so
okay.
you are joking when you say that, I think.
Yes.
Um, okay. So but just that that's been discussed as a possibility. We could also say maybe his father's attitude towards corporate, I don't know, focus on money and stuff could have
Hmm.
influenced him or something like that. Sometimes it's like, what do we inherit from our parents in terms of their
Right.
attitudes towards money? That
Yep.
could be, and it could be that that's what we're seeing here. Who's to
Hmm.
say?
Yeah, well,
But
and yeah, and to be fair, like sometimes it's literally like you're going into the type of field and making a living from like what your parents did.
sure, yeah. Which was certainly like with the Gucci example was definitely what happened there.
Hmm.
Um, Other examples, this is a good one that I love, which is I only learned about in the past few years. This is Princess Mako of Japan. And she has this nice Venus Jupiter conjunction in Virgo in the second house. And she was literally like a princess in the royal family line of Japan. And so therefore very well off financially.
Mm-hmm.
But she has Saturn in the seventh house in a night chart in Aquarius. And she fell in love with and then wanted to marry a commoner who was not royalty. But in order to do it, she had to essentially give up her family titles and give up the large like monthly stipend that she would get financially, that was coming from her like royal family line basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was interesting that she has Virgo on the second house with Venus and Jupiter there, but then Mercury is the ruler and it's placed in Scorpio in the fourth house conjunct Mars and Pluto and
Mm-hmm.
sort of widely squaring that Saturn, so it's like you get that tension there.
Right. That tension and then potentially that like loss at some point with Pluto.
Yeah. So as a member of the royal family, she received an annual allowance from the government, but upon marrying a commoner, she was entitled to a one-time lump sum payment of 1.3 million. She also used to have access to palace resources and support staff, but after the marriage, she chose to decline the lump sum payment, and she lost her royal status and all of the associated benefits.
Mm.
So now she and her husband rely on their own incomes, and she works as an unpaid volunteer at the Metropolitan Art Museum in New York, while her husband works at a law firm. So
Mhm.
I just thought that was a cute story, and there was like some Saturn return stuff with that as well,
Mm.
where I think she may have officially renounced her titles finally when Saturn was in an Aquarius a few years ago during the Saturn return.
Mm.
Um,
Makes sense.
yeah,
Yeah, makes sense. That's funny too with that Saturn in a night chart overcoming the like exalted moon in Taurus in the 10th and like that literal tension of like her exalted role in society, being at odds with like marrying who she wanted to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. The last one I thought was kind of funny, um, that I just found that we had a time chart for is Joe Rogan, who has one of the biggest podcasts in the world that he developed over the past decade, for better or worse. But what was interesting about him is he has Taurus rising with Gemini on the second house, and the ruler is Mercury, which is in Leo in the fourth house. And I thought that was fascinating, basically, because he found a way essentially to make tons and tons of money working at home,
Mm-hmm.
where they set up the podcast studio in his house, and he literally like has guests out to his home essentially, and then they record a conversation and it's released to the world. But the most broad sense, like if you were just trying to interpret the placement archetypally, the two options, if you see the ruler of the second and the fourth, is you would either say, well, there may be something about your finances that's connected with your family or your parents. Another delineation that's basic that you could give is that there may be something connected between your finances and your home or living situation. And if
Mm-hmm.
you said that to him at some point early in his life, it would turn out to be stunningly true later on.
Right. Well, in this case in particular, it's like you're making a living from like talking at home. It's Mercury ruling the second, like conjunct the IC in the fourth.
Yeah, totally. And it's
Yeah.
like, Pisces is the 11th house of friends, and Jupiter's the ruler of the 11th house of friends, and it's
Mhm.
there in the fourth house conjunct Mercury. So it's maybe
It
something
is.
about how he has friends out to his house to have those conversations as well. So there's
Right.
more complex things going on there and other things. But
Hmm.
as a basic delineation, I just wanted to mention that because it's impressive.
Right. And sometimes when you see connections between the second and fourth or 10th and fourth, it really is just that simple. It's like the person works from home or lives where they works or they work or things like that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's move on to the fifth house.
Yep.
Incredible one for the fifth house. Walt Disney, Virgo rising, Libra in the second house. Libra is the second whole sign house, and it's ruled by Venus, which is placed in the fifth house of children. And he
Mm-hmm.
literally created an animation, an art company, Disney, which makes movies for children.
Mm-hmm.
And then became wildly, wildly wealthy as a result of that.
Right. So the animation film aspect of entertainment and then children more broadly as the company expanded.
Yeah, and with the Disney theme parks and broader things. But I think
Mm-hmm.
it's just interesting that ultimately he ended up making his fortune, largely from children,
Mm-hmm.
essentially, more or less.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
i- Interestingly, with the moon in the second house, he liked to collect things. So his interests were varied. He collected,
Another
what was
one of
that?
those.
Yeah. So he collected
Oh, I just
miniature
said another one of those.
trains, which was perhaps his most well-known. Yeah, so he connected miniature trains, arts and antiques, books, and memorabilia. So I thought that was amazing as a continuing theme. Um, a great comparison is George Lucas. So George Lucas was born with Taurus rising, Uranus and Saturn in the second house. I believe this is a day chart. Like I very strongly think he was born with a day chart, and this was one of my first examples that showed me that when the sun starts getting within 6 degrees of the ascendant, like it starts acting like a day chart because it's bright out by the time the person is born. So I think he has
Mm-hmm.
a day chart, Gemini on the second house, and Mercury, the ruler, rules the fifth house at the same time. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like there's a connection between money and the fifth house topic of children. He has Mercury in the first house in Taurus, and Mercury is stationing direct a day after he was born. So it's pretty much
Mm-hmm.
stationary there, conjunct Venus, right on the ascendant.
Mm-hmm.
And the brilliant thing about George Lucas is that when he sold Star Wars when he made the deal for Star Wars before he made it, he somehow got them to give him the merchandising rights to the entire thing. So, because that hadn't really been done before and they didn't think it was going to be a huge deal.
Mm-hmm.
So, but what ended up happening is he released this movie that was like hugely popular, especially with kids. And then he started making tons and tons of toys from it and
Mm,
like sold tons of action figures and other things like that to children and made just an obscene amount of money as a result of the merchandising rights for Star Wars.
that's great. Yeah,
Yeah.
I like that.
So that's smart, business savvy, and that's one of the ways if there's a connection between the second and the fifth that things can work out. Um, Another one that I found, another way that can work out. So this is the birth chart of Heidi Fleiss, um, who was a famous Hollywood madame in the 1990s that like came up in the news when she was arrested or busted for creating a prostitution ring essentially in
Mm,
Hollywood in the 1990s. So she was born with Aquarius rising, Venus Mars conjunction right on the ascendant in the first house. The ruler of the ascendant is Saturn, which is in Pisces in the second house, showing a
mm,
focus on financial matters. And then the ruler of the second house of finances is Jupiter, which is placed in the fifth house. And one of the
mhm.
significations of the fifth house is sex and sexuality.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty perfect. Also, the ruler of the 12th is in the second, in terms of, connecting the topics of, prisons and your livelihood.
Right, because she was arrested and went to jail for a period of time.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and then also there was a lot of scandal during her trials about whether she would release like supposedly like a black book of names of people that she had been connected with, which she never ended up releasing. But I
Mm,
thought it was interesting because Jupiter is in Gemini in the fifth house, and it's in a mutual reception with Mercury in the 11th house of friends and groups and alliances. So there's a strong connection between like the 11th house of friends, the second house of finances, the fifth house of sex, and the eighth house of
mm.
other people's money between those two planets.
Right. Yeah, there's a mutable cross there going on.
Yeah, so that was cool. Okay, I think that's it for fifth house examples.
Hmm.
All right, I'm going to splice this in post, but there was an example chart that I forgot to include because we were going to do a separate section on transits, but we ended up not doing that and instead integrating most of the transit examples throughout the episode. But there was one that I forgot to reintegrate, and it's the birth chart of the rapper Dr. Dre. So here's his chart. So he has he was born with Gemini rising and Cancer on the second house. And the ruler of the second house is the moon, which is in Libra in the fifth whole sign house. And it's in pretty good shape. It's applying to a trine with Venus and the midheaven in Aquarius with reception, since the moon is in Venus's sign. And I've used him as an example for a number of years because that's such a auspicious and positive second house placement. And what happened is about 10 years ago in 2014, he'd founded a headphones company called Beats Electronics. And these headphones became wildly popular back then, so that lots of people were wearing them, especially lots of younger people. And they were pretty expensive headphones. They were like designer headphones at the time. And yeah, it was interesting because like headphones are like entertainment and they're used for entertainment, especially those headphones. And I think that's part of the manifestation of the ruler of the second house of finances in the fifth house of entertainment and fun and pleasure and everything else. So what happens is he founded this headphone company, but then in 2014, the headphone company was acquired by Apple. So the biggest company in the world bought out this headphone company, and it was Apple's second biggest acquisition ever, where Dr. Dre and his business partner sold Beats to Apple for $3 billion. So this is just like a crazy amount of money, and it was going to make Dr. Dre a billionaire, and it was going to make him the first rapper who was a billionaire. So what was interesting is um, this deal starts happening. Let me put the transits up because I had used this as an example before, but I went back and reviewed it and was looking at the transits, and the transits were incredible because in early 2014, when they're working out this deal and it first starts coming together, transiting Jupiter was in Cancer. So literally, Jupiter was transiting his second house when this deal comes together, where suddenly he's about to become a billionaire, basically, and become just wildly wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. So Jupiter's transiting his second house. But at the same time, Mars is retrograde in Libra. And on this date, on Mars 8th, um, so the deal's coming together, and he goes out and he parties and he starts partying with his friends, and he reportedly says, like, I'm going to become the first billionaire rapper ever. And what happens is that one of his friends takes a video and then posts it on Facebook and like leaks the video, not realizing that it needed to stay private or something, I guess. But the video went viral and went everywhere, and it really upset Apple. And the head of Apple at the time called him in to the office to chew him out, basically, about this. And there was a real concern whether the deal was going to be canceled altogether, because the secrecy of the deal, the Apple executives had made a really important point that it had to be kept secret until it was finalized, and Dr. Dre had essentially just leaked it accidentally. So look at Mars. Mars is retrograde at 9 degrees of Libra, and it's coming up on a conjunction with his moon at 7 degrees of Libra on the day that this is leaked, basically. And then all of a sudden, the press and everybody starts reporting on it. So, Mars, though, it's actually slowing down in order to station direct. I'm going to advance the chart. And just like basically like a week and a half later, or 2 weeks later, Mars stations at 9 degrees of Libra on top of Dr. Dre's moon, the ruler of his second house. And what ended up happening is that the head of Apple, Tim Cook, called him into his office and chewed him out. And he said he wasn't going to cancel the deal, but he was going to um, drop the offer by $200,000, so that instead of becoming a billionaire at that time, Dr. Dre would become worth like $800 million dollars or something like that, putting it just under $1 billion. So I thought this was an amazing example because, on the one hand, we have the Jupiter transit and having this like wildly successful financial deal where your company is getting bought for billions of dollars, and suddenly you have the largest financial windfall of your life with Jupiter transiting the second house. But then it's a day chart, and Mars was transiting the ruler of the second house at the same time, and not just transiting it, but actually stationing on it. And so something negative happened at the same time, which is that the deal was thrown in jeopardy. It was almost canceled. And then he ended up making significantly less than he was going to make, was subtracted from the offer before it went through. So eventually they worked things out and the deal still went through, and they finalized, I think, in August of that year. But I thought this was a fascinating example because, on the one hand, it shows you see like the natal signature and the potential for wealth, because the ruler of the second is well placed in the fifth. It has reception with its ruler, with Venus. It's applying to a trine with Venus. And then you see the positive Jupiter transit in the second and the negative Mars transit on the ruler of the second at the same time. So sometimes people struggle with that when there's positive and negative indications at the same time. And usually what it means is that you get both, that something positive happens, but something negative happens at the same time. Sometimes they happen in parallel, just like simultaneously, but other times one will happen and then the other will happen. So you'll have like one step forward, one step back, or something like that. But this is one way that that can manifest in his chart. So I just wanted to share that, not just as a ruler of the second and the fifth example, but also as a transiting example as well, just because the transits are really important in terms of timing the activation of some of these placements at the same time. All right, so that's it.
It's a
I
good one.
only I only have one. um, sixth house example, and it's Leona Helmsley, who you could do a whole write-up in it of itself.
Mm,
Um, she has Cancer rising, had Cancer rising, and Jupiter in the second house in Leo in a day chart, and she became very wealthy. Interestingly, with Aries on the 10th house and the ruler Mars in the fourth house, she became wealthy from running hotels. She created a bunch of hotels and did a bunch of land deals and building deals and different things like that. But
mm,
she's primarily known as a hotel person.
mhm,
Um, she amassed, though, this huge wealth, and she also got some of it from marrying a very famous hotel developer. But then they worked together. But when she died, she ended up leaving behind all this money. But one of the things that she did is she left behind like millions of dollars to her dog.
mhm.
And I always thought that was such a funny example. And I use that as an example of the ruler of the sixth house, which represents pets, in the second house of finances. And she left her dog millions of dollars.
Literally the wealthiest dog in the world.
Literally, the probably, I mean, yeah. So, what was funny though is I think Saturn afterwards started transiting Leo and transiting her second house. And the dog, with like the new people that are supposed to take care of it, put it on a diet because she had fed it like wildly crazy food like caviar and stuff like
Mhm.
that. And the news headline said that it had been put on a diet of like dog food and like Alpo and stuff like that. So the
Oh,
dog was literally having like a Saturn transit
right.
through over that Jupiter.
That's hilarious. Yeah.
Yeah. There's other stuff with her chart that's interesting, but I will leave it at that for the
Mhm,
sixth house. The sixth house is underrepresented, but
mm,
we'll come back to it in future episodes.
mhm,
All right, seventh house. One of my favorite examples that I found of the seventh house is Laura Wasser, who has Libra rising, Scorpio in the second house, so that Mars is ruling the second house of finances and the seventh house of relationships, and it's placed in the ninth house, which can sometimes represent the law and the courts and things related to that.
mhm,
And Laura Wasser is a famous lawyer who specializes in celebrity divorces.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really perfect. Just Mars being severing and her livelihood being like using the courts to sever things. Mars also ruling the seventh house of partnership.
Yeah. Mars, its most ancient symbol for Mars is a knife. And that's
Mhm,
one of its core meanings is severing or separating something. So
mhm,
she makes her fortune, second house, by helping people to get divorced, seventh house, and to sever or separate their marriage, Mars, in a
mhm.
legal context with the courts, ninth house.
Right. Hmm. Right. And her ascendant ruler is even like in the eighth house of like shared resources, like bringing in that topic as like a strong focus of her life.
Yeah, totally. And even the 10th house of career and reputation is Cancer, and it's ruled by the moon, which is in Aries in the seventh house of relationships and
Hmm.
marriage.
Hmm. Something I noticed when I was looking at this chart was just like her Jupiter is just like helping out everything in her chart. So you wouldn't always, for instance, think Mars in a day chart ruling the second is like wildly successful lawyer, like even if the ruler of the second is in the ninth because it's Mars in a day chart, but it's just like Mars has reception with Saturn, Mars is applying to Jupiter, Mercury's applying to Jupiter, the moon's applying to Jupiter, like Venus as her ascendant ruler in the eighth, which isn't like one of the good houses, is also applying closely to Jupiter. So Jupiter's like helping everything as a side note.
Yeah, especially with that moon, like at 26 degrees of Aries ruling the 10th house, and it's
Hmm.
applying to that exact trine with Jupiter at 27 Leo is just a perfect condition of bonification.
Hmm. Yeah.
So just to give you an idea, she's handled the high profile, high net worth disillusions, which is another interesting term, including those for Angelina Jolie, Heidi Klum, Kim Kardashian, Kris Jenner, Johnny Depp, Ryan Reynolds, Christina Aguilera, Hilary Duff, Wonder, Maria Shriver, Dr. Dre, and Kevin Costner. Um, and the last interesting point, it says, yeah, actually, I'll skip that, but very interesting chart, very cool
Hmm.
chart.
Yep.
All right, so moving on. You already mentioned Charles Ponzi, who had the ruler
Hmm.
of the second and the seventh, and he ripped people off.
Yes.
I've mentioned Johnny Carson. Oh, I'm still showing the charts. I mentioned Johnny Carson, who had the ruler of the seventh and the second, and he had a very famous and costly celebrity divorce, one of the most costly divorces in history at the time.
Hmm.
There's a similar thing with Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had um, Capricorn on the seventh house. The ruler is Saturn in the second house. And he was very successful financially, but then he had a famous celebrity divorce, and it was one of the like a very costly celebrity divorce
Hmm.
with Saturn in the second house. One that I came across that was interesting that I just came across the birth data of and researched was the comedian Bobby Lee, who evidently we have a time chart for. He has Sagittarius rising, Capricorn on the second house of finances, and the ruler is the moon, or I'm sorry, the ruler is
Saturn.
Saturn,
Mm.
which is located in Gemini in the seventh whole sign house. And Bobby was like a famous comedian that was famous in the 90s because he was on the hit television show Mad TV. And he was also in some movies and like some music videos, but his career was kind of in decline by um the early 2010s. And what happened is that he got together into this relationship um with a woman, his girlfriend named Kalila Kuhn, and they ended up starting a podcast together called Tiger Belly, and this podcast became very successful, and it basically revived his somewhat declining career as a comedian and as an actor when they started it in 2015. But the only
Mm.
reason he did it was um, with her and getting together. And there were tensions later because they eventually broke up just in the past few years, but they've stayed friends and they've continued working together and hosting the podcast together so that it's
Mm.
still like something they do together, but it's something that wouldn't have happened without that connection through his partner at the time.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Nice to see a non-divorce example of the connections between the second and seventh.
Yeah, it's not always negative things. It
No.
can also be really, really positive things.
Right.
There's a lot of interesting transits connected with his chart and their relationships. Like she has Jupiter and Mars in Capricorn in the second house, in his second house.
Hmm.
So it's like that's the other thing is sometimes people's synastry plays a role as well.
Right, for sure.
All right, so that was interesting. Another one like that it's not like that, but another connection is Monica Lewinsky. Have you seen this? Can you see
Mhm.
this chart?
Yes. I can.
Okay, so this is Libra rising. She has Scorpio is the second house, and the ruler of the second house is Mars, which is placed in the seventh house of relationships in a day chart. And
Mhm.
she famously had an affair with Bill Clinton. And then one of the things I thought was interesting, and just in seeing this, just as I was searching for examples, was just how this impacted then her finances. Because on
Mhm.
the one hand, she would later do some interviews and some books and stuff so that she ended up making some money from it as a result of the affair later on. But she also had like huge amounts of debt from legal cases and stuff. So
Mm.
she ended up having to use a lot of that money in order to pay some different things off as a result of that. And when she later tried to get different jobs and stuff, she ran into challenges and was unable to as a result of the stigma of that sort of following her.
Right.
So I thought it was interesting just in a case of both negative and positive things, but just that there was a connection between that and her finances.
Mhm. Right, that, like, initially her place of, making a livelihood made her, like, meet a romantic partner in a sense, but then, later it was, like, the scandal of that affair then, like, hindered her future, finances.
Yeah, exactly. Um, More recently, she became an advocate against cyberbullying and against like an anti-bullying activist in general. And that's
Mhm.
also, I think, partially tied in with that as well as having been on the receiving end of that with Mars in the seventh house of like other people.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
All right. And then one last one is a historical version of this, which is William Lilly, who the 17th century astrologer who had Pisces rising, Aries on the second house, and the ruler is Mars in Virgo in the seventh house. And he famously um, got together with a woman who was like well off, and he like courted her, and then they got married. And then she passed away at some point. She was like an older woman and she passed away. And then he inherited her estate essentially. It became him, made him a wealthy person.
Yeah. Interesting with one of the benefics in the eighth and then of inheritance. And then, yeah, this being a night chart with Mars ruling the second and the seventh is like very different. You can see then the day chart of Monica Lewinsky's same placement.
Exactly. And just Mars being more challenging by day or more constructive by night.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. That's the last seventh house example.
Good.
Um, eighth house. Eighth house is kind of tricky. Have we talked about some eighth house ones so far?
We have, yeah, because like inheritance, investments, other people's money. There's all those connections
Right.
with the second. If the second house is connected with the eighth house, it's often one of those topics.
Okay.
Mortality in Danny DeVito's case.
Right. I mean, that's one of my examples. I'm going to skip some of my examples are kind of morbid, so I'm going to skip that one. I think we've probably done some other eighth house examples already, right?
Yeah, I mean, a bunch of them, basically a lot of the wealthy people like either inherited it or was it from investments, other people's money, in other words. So yeah, I mean,
Right.
there's been a lot of eighth house already.
I did. The very first example I did was the inheritance one from Lisa Marie Presley, who had the
Hmm.
ruler of the second and the eighth, and the ruler of the eighth and the second.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's good then.
Okay.
I'm still showing William Lilly's chart
You are.
while we're talking.
Yes.
Let me just let me just show Lisa Marie Presley's chart again, then for the sake of the video viewers, so you can remind yourself of what that looked like, where she had Leo rising, Jupiter in the second house in Virgo. The ruler is Mercury in Pisces, and the ruler of the eighth house is Jupiter, which is in Virgo.
Hmm.
So very strong connection between the place of inheritance, place of money, and she inherited Elvis's entire estate at the age of 25 at the beginning of a second house perfection year.
Hmm.
Um, okay, ninth house. We talked about Madonna's chart a little bit, probably actually way extensively enough, but I just wanted to reiterate that I think it's interesting. She has that Mars in the ninth house, and there's sometimes those issues of uh, perception of like blasphemy and religious matters, or
Hmm.
sometimes integrating like sexual like imagery with religious matters, which is also like a Mars thing.
Hmm.
But it's like that Venus is ruled that Venus is ruling the ninth house and the second house,
Hmm.
and so it's like that's part of what's also generated money for her to some extent was her some of the ways in which she did that and some of the rebelliousness she has, because that Mars is actually pretty closely square Uranus at 12 degrees of Leo. And
Hmm.
that's the primary, it's not the only way, but that's the primary way that the Uranus placement comes through in the chart.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And then also that I think part of the delineation for her was also with the ruler of the second house of finances and the ninth house of religion and the 12th house of enemies, is that she ended up benefiting to some extent from some of her enemies and
Hmm.
people that were protesting against her that tried to shut down that partnership with Pepsi. But ultimately, arguably, you could say that it potentially may have worked out in her favor, I think, because Venus is sextile the midheaven, therefore it's mitigated in the 12th.
Yeah, and it's so interesting when people have like positive 12th house things, and that's one of the ways that can work out is like you somehow benefit from your enemy's actions, which you wouldn't think would be like a thing that happened very often, and certainly it doesn't much of the time. But in those cases where there's like benefics connected with the 12th, that can sometimes happen. You can sometimes see that
Yeah.
happen.
Or to phrase it differently, like you benefit from those who try to work against you or from those who you don't get along with
Hmm. Yeah,
is
exactly.
is one possible delineation. There's other delineations. I know isolation is like a theme of the 12th that you really like.
Yes. Yeah, people who earn their living in seclusion or yeah.
Yeah. All right. One
But
other that I like for the ninth house. What?
no, go ahead. I was just gonna say, but the ninth house, which we're still on.
Deepak Chopra has Pisces rising, Aries on the second house, and the ruler is Mars in the ninth house in a day chart, along with Jupiter and Mercury. And he's famous for writing a lot of books. Essentially, that he's made money at talking about spirituality and trying to tie that together with like science and religion.
Yeah, interesting. I like that he has the ascendant ruler, Jupiter and Mars co-present in the ninth house. So like tying together like his life orientation and the way he makes a living in the house of religion.
Exactly. All right. Moving on. 10th house ones. I was super stoked to find this one. We have the birth chart, we have the birth time of the founder of Forbes magazine,
Nice.
who was born in like 1880, but his name is BC Forbes, and he had he had Leo rising, Uranus, or sorry, Virgo on the second whole sign house, and the ruler is Mercury, which is in Taurus in the 10th house, conjunct Venus, with a whole Taurus stellium of Mercury, Venus, Neptune, Sun, and Pluto. And he ended up founding a magazine, studying wealth and studying the wealthy, basically.
Wow, that's perfect. I
Isn't that brilliant?
I mean, especially with the ruler of the second, not just prominently placed, this is saying he's like a prominent person, right? With regard to finances, but or the topic of finances, but Mercury can like applying to conjoin closely, the ruler of the third, and it's like the magazine.
Exactly.
And then just that Taurus stellium in general in terms of like wealth, materiality.
Yeah. So, and it's like many of the people who's we've talked about in terms of their net worth and knowing that it's like we know that because of like Forbes magazine today
Mm,
tracking some of the wealthiest people in the world.
yeah, that's really good. I like this one.
Yeah. Well, tracking the wealth of the eminent.
Exactly. Yeah, with that 10th house stellium.
Yeah.
Mm,
All right. So that was one. J. Paul Getty is like a really common example that I use. It's one of my core chart examples in my book in my course. And he had Capricorn rising with Aquarius ruling the second house, and the ruler is Saturn, which is exalted in Libra in the 10th whole sign house in a day chart, opposite Jupiter. And he was like this huge tycoon, and he was the wealthiest man in the world at one point, but he was like obsessed with work and
mm,
focused on work constantly. And he was also a little bit like miserly, where he refused to pay like a ransom for like a family member that was kidnapped at one point.
wow, that's terrible.
Yeah, so good times. There's two other examples that tie together of Mercury, like BC Forbes, that I thought were interesting and complementary examples. One of them is Reuben Hurricane Carter, who had Leo rising, Virgo on the second house, and the ruler is Mercury in Taurus in the 10th house. So it's similar to the Forbes chart, except in this case, Mercury's retrograde. And what happened is that he was arrested. Somebody was murdered, and then he was falsely arrested and convicted for the murder and imprisoned for it for a number of years.
Mm,
But then eventually his story became known and he became known for it, and different people lobbied to get him released and even wrote songs about him. Like Bob Dylan in the 1960s or 70s wrote a famous song about him to bring awareness to his case. And
mm,
then eventually he was released. And after he got out, he was able to make some income by talking about his story and doing different deals related to that, and then eventually becoming an advocate for other people who were falsely imprisoned. So
mm,
the main point I wanted to make with this is one of the core interpretations of retrograde planets in ancient astrology is that they indicate delays in the manifestation of whatever they signify in the chart. So in
mm,
his case, because it's really in the second house, it's delays in financial income or wealth, so that it came about very late in his life, essentially, that he became successful financially because he was falsely imprisoned, which is the other part of the Mercury retrograde.
Yeah, that makes sense. He's also got the ruler of the 12th, like applying to that Mercury closely.
Yeah, and there's some other stuff I used as a chart as an example in the episode on the Lot of Fortune, because he has the Lot of Fortune in Gemini. And so Mercury, the ruler, is actually in the 12th house from Fortune, which is the place of
Mm-hmm.
jail in fortune houses or prison.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he was arrested with a friend who was also falsely accused.
Okay.
So there's all sorts of things there.
Mm-hmm.
So his chart, and then I found that George Carlin was actually born very close to him, the comedian, and he
Mm-hmm.
was also born with Leo rising. But on the other side of the retrograde, where Mercury's still retrograde, but it's not long after the Cazimi.
Mm-hmm.
So he has Virgo on the second house, and Mercury is ruling that. It's retrograde in the 10th house, retrograding back to conjoin Uranus. And he was a comedian, but he wasn't very successful when he was younger. It was mainly once he got older that he eventually found success as a comedian and then made quite a bit of money in his later years. But in
Mm-hmm.
his early years, it wasn't as good.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good example of that. I also like that it's like right on the midheaven, and then like with Uranus while Mercury's retrograding back to Uranus, because he was like, I don't remember a lot of his stuff, but I know that he was like known for trying to be like edgy, like as a persona.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He had like a joke about the, what was it, the 10 like curse
The
words that you can't
things you can't
say.
say. Yeah, right.
Yeah. All right. So I think that's it for the 10th house. Um, Moving on to the 11th house, you have an amazing example with
Hmm.
Anthony Bourdain.
Yeah, so this is one of those where sometimes it's like one pivotal event in someone's life makes like the most sense of a placement. And so he had Leo rising, Mercury's ruling the second house of Virgo, placed in its own sign of Gemini in the 11th house, co-present with Venus also in Gemini. Um, and Venus is ruling the third house of like books and he was a chef, he was a cook for like many years until like his 40s, and it's only then when he started to become really famous, like from his books, and then the books spawned into, TV shows and things like that. And so anyway, I was like, why is the ruler of the second house of income in the 11th house of friends or groups? And I thought partly it was like that he worked with teams, right? Like even when you're a cook, like in a restaurant, you're working as a team, and like he worked with teams on his shows, but I was like, is there a friend connection here? And I finally found that it was his college roommate that actually got him his kind of randomly got him his first book deal, which was like a novel. It wasn't even like the books he got famous for. His college roommate was like talking to some mutual friend who was like worked for a publishing place and was like, I have friends. He was kind of boasting. He was like, I have friends who write better than the people you're publishing. And the agent was kind of like challenging him, like, okay, well then find me one. And he didn't want to like call his bluff. And so he told Anthony, who did write, he's like, I need a manuscript. And so he like paid him to like write 100 pages of like a book to give to the guy. And the guy said, okay, I'll buy it for $10,000. And they went in 50-50 on this. And so he gave his friend like Anthony gave his friend 5,000 of it. And that is how he started doing his books. That was like his first published book.
Wow, that's amazing. So it's like
Yeah.
his the most general thing we could say about this chart with the ruler of the second house of finances in the 11th house of friends is that somehow your finances at some point will be connected with your friendships. And
Hmm.
that would be stunningly true in this instance.
Yeah, but it was like, he did lots of other collaborative stuff later too. You could say, as a general thing, that was true. But like the really pivotal thing about the connection between those two houses was like this kind of one-time unique event.
Yeah, for sure. And there was probably like activations at the time by progressions and transits and stuff as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah. All right. I have a lot of similar examples like that with 11th house ones. Steve Wozniak is like my classic example that I always use of that because he was um, the friend of Steve Jobs, and then the two of them founded Apple Computers in like their garage.
Mm,
And Steve Wozniak had Virgo rising, has Virgo rising, and Libra on the second house, ruled by Venus, which is in the 11th house of friends, extremely well placed. And he became incredibly wealthy as a result of this connection or this friendship that he had with Steve Jobs when they founded Apple Computer. And then Steve Jobs was so brilliant in terms of marketing and other things, whereas Wozniak was like the technical genius who literally like programmed and created some of the early Mac Apple computers. And then it created what is today, I think, like the biggest company in the world, or maybe one of the most profitable companies or something like that.
Yeah. Right. So again, just like, without that like friend connection, that just whole thing would not have unfolded for him.
Exactly. So another way that I see the 11th house come up when I was doing this research is in um, social media.
Hmm.
And the most stunning example of that is Jack Dorsey, who is the founder of Twitter,
Yeah.
who was born with Virgo rising. The 11th house is Cancer, and the ruler is the moon, which is placed in Libra in the second house, conjunct Pluto widely.
Mm.
So it's like, again, the connection here is between like friends and finances, but in a modern 21st century context, sometimes what friends means is like social networking. And for
Hmm.
him, he literally created one of the leading social networking sites in the early 20th century, which is 21st century, which is Twitter, which is now X.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I see social networks come up a lot with the 11th as well.
yeah. Um, and trying to find it. Where is it? He's worth an estimated $4.1 billion today.
With Venus
So
ruling the second in a night chart. It's a benefic of sect.
yeah. So just to give you some context about, you know, extreme connections between wealth and, in this instance, social networking.
Hmm. Yep. Good one.
Another one like that I found is Kim Kardashian. And this is one that I'd used before. But I came back to it, and it was the more I looked into her life, because I didn't know like a ton about it before, but the more I did, the more the chart made sense, the more amazing it was.
Mm.
But the primary thing here is that she has Sagittarius rising, Capricorn ruling the second house of finances, as well as the third house of siblings. And it's placed in the 11th house where Saturn is in Libra. It's exalted. It's got an out of sign conjunction with Jupiter. It's a very well placed Saturn. And
Hmm.
um, I had always used it as an example because she initially came to prominence and through her friend Paris Hilton, where she had this friend connection with Paris Hilton, who was like a famous socialite that was in reality television in the mid 2000s. And then through that connection, Kim Kardashian made a few appearances on Paris Hilton's like reality television show, and then later would end up going on to start her own reality television show that involved her family as well as several of her siblings as like the focus of the show.
Hmm.
Um, but you know, one, the point is that she originally sort of started making a lot of money through her connection with Paris Hilton. But then two, um, she credits social media with a large part of her success.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
So, because she's in that tie over period between like the late 2000s and the early 2010s. And one of the things that she did is she really was one of the first people that really used social media to its utmost extent in order to promote her products, basically, not just her products, but her show, her
Mm.
siblings, and everything else. And she's actually worth an estimated $1.7 billion today, according to Forbes. She had one of the longest running reality television shows in the country in history. And what else about that? I'm trying to see what else that she I have a quote from her where she talked about being wealthy as a result of social media, that she has developed a significant presence online across numerous social media platforms, including hundreds of millions of followers on Twitter and Instagram, and that it played a crucial role in her success. So that she says, quote unquote, I totally attribute my career to social media. There are
Mhm.
pitfalls, she added, such as lack of privacy, and that's not for everyone, but for me, I can handle it.
Mhm. Yeah,
So
that's good.
I thought that was really good. Interestingly, her mother, Kris Jenner, is the one who evidently came up with the idea of doing a like a reality show based on the family and who
Mm,
originally pitched it. And she's actually has Virgo rising with Mercury in Libra conjunct Neptune and Mars in Libra in the second house.
mm,
So I know there's been things there about like questions about how much she's like the matriarch of the family and how much she's the architect behind the like hugely successful careers that each of her children have had
mm.
through the social media and different things. And it's interesting just seeing her focus on the second house with the birth chart placement.
Totally, and then Jupiter ruling, the other chart, ruling the 4th house placed on the midheaven.
Yeah, with Kim Kardashian's chart,
Mhm.
totally.
Yeah,
Um, that she has Pisces fourth house and the midheaven and Jupiter ruling the fourth house, and it's exactly on the midheaven at 28 degrees of Virgo.
right.
Yeah, that's perfect. So interesting side note that I have to mention in terms of a transit. Um, a few years ago in 2016, um, Kim Kardashian was robbed at gunpoint in her Paris hotel room when she was visiting Paris for Fashion Week. And it was this hugely like traumatic experience for her where masked men broke into her room, tied her up, and stole millions of dollars worth of jewelry. And she has spoken openly about how the experience changed her perspective on security, privacy, and material possessions. So I was able to track down the date. It happened October 13th, 2016, and Mars was transiting Capricorn, her second house at the time.
Wow, yeah, that's crazy.
Isn't that striking?
It's very striking. Yes.
Let me show it really quickly. There it is. So Mars was at 4 degrees of Capricorn,
I'm not seeing it.
transiting.
Just so you know, I'm not seeing
Oh,
the Bible.
here, let me
Oh,
switch. There we go. Let me know if you can see it.
yeah, I can see.
So Mars was at 4 degrees of Capricorn the day that the robbery happened in her second house of money and possession and finances, and it was squaring her Saturn, which is the ruler of her second house, which is
Mhm.
at 3 degrees of Libra.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of what it was, is she had not just a she has a day chart. So Mars is the most difficult planet for her. She's having not just a negative transit through that house, but also hitting the Lord or the ruler of the second house at the same time.
Mhm.
She also had Saturn transiting over her ascendant. Saturn was at 11 degrees of um, Sagittarius and her hitting her ascendant at 13. So you can see the bodily fears and stuff as well.
Mhm.
But there was also counteracting positive transits where transiting Jupiter was at 5 Libra, sort of near that Saturn. So that didn't end up being the worst case scenario. And Jupiter at 5 degrees of Libra was also sextiling her Mars at 6 degrees of Sagittarius in her first house, because you know, that's a problematic placement for bodily things, potentially Mars in the first house in a date chart, but it
Mhm.
was getting mitigated by that transit from Jupiter.
Yeah, yeah, that's really good because, yeah, that sounds like a terrifying experience. So it's good that she had some positive transits going on as well.
Yeah, totally. So lots of other interesting stuff there. I'll leave it at that. Um, Weirdly, I noticed I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this story because I know we're running out of time. Paris Hilton, her friend who Kim Kardashian originally became famous and started becoming wealthy as a result of that connection with, Paris
Mm.
Hilton also has Sagittarius rising, so that's probably why they
Mhm.
got along because they have
Mhm.
almost the same ascendant degree. And
Mm.
Paris Hilton also has Saturn ruling the second house, placed in the 11th house, conjunct
Right.
Jupiter in the midheaven,
Mhm.
and she was famously, a socialite and became famous early on, especially not just as a socialite, but having a reality television show called The
Mhm.
Simple Life that she did with her childhood friend, Nicole Richie.
Mhm.
And that was when her sort of popularity really blew up in the 2000s.
Yeah, that's interesting, thinking about the nature of the 11th house and it being like social media very much these days, as well as your, just regular friends or groups you belong to. But like thinking about the nature of like some of those houses, the specific manifestations can change over time or culturally. And just thinking about like that is probably like what that was before is like the socialite, like the society pages, right? It'd be like you would
Mm,
expect if you had birth times for people, they would like have 11th house connections from like
right.
hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, let's move on to the 12th house, the very last house.
Hmm.
Um, I've already talked about Madonna's 12th house placement and how that worked out, which is probably one of our most striking examples of that and how it can
Hmm.
sometimes work out positively if there's good connections with the 12th house,
Hmm.
making money from one's enemies or as a
Right.
result of them.
Right.
Um, Another one, Yoko Ono had has Libra rising, Scorpio on the second house, Mars ruling the second house of finances and the seventh house of relationships, but it's in the 12th house of
Mm.
loss. And she ended up, her husband, John Lennon, was assassinated by like a crazy person in the 1980s and died. He was shot unexpectedly, and then she inherited his entire estate. So that's part of that placement or how I would connect that a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
go ahead.
Oh, no, no, you go.
And then the other ones that I found were connected with jails. So one of the most ancient associations with the 12th house is prisons.
Hmm.
Actually, really quickly, I had mentioned Lillian Bettencourt as another 12th house example. So just remember her and that somebody potentially took advantage of her in her old age
Hmm.
um, for finances and gifts and a weird relationship thing with the ruler of the seventh and the second, and the ruler of the second and the ruler of the 12th and the second. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, the other ones, the last ones that had to do with prisons, one of them is um, Sam Bankman Fried. Do you see the chart?
No, not yet. I see Betancourt still. Okay, there we go. Oh,
Oh,
we had it for a
okay.
minute.
Here we go. So he was born with Taurus rising. He has Gemini on the second house, and the ruler is Mercury, which is placed in the 12th house. And he was involved in the largest financial fraud in history, where his um, cryptocurrency company essentially folded, and he was doing negative things. And then he's been sentenced to, I think, 25 years in prison and to face a huge amount of restitution.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So his financial activities led him to prison. It's the ruler of the second and the 12th.
Yeah, exactly. Um, so his attempts to enrich himself led to imprisonment, I think is the delineation essentially. And
Mm-hmm.
he committed the largest financial fraud in history due to the collapse of his cryptocurrency exchange, FTX, and the associated misappropriation of customer funds, where the estimated losses are in just tens of billions of dollars.
Yeah.
So he was sentenced to 25 years in prison, 3 years supervised release, and ordered to pay $11 billion in, interesting keyword, forfeiture for his orchestration of multiple fraudulent schemes. Um, in the context of what he has to pay, forfeiture refers to the forced surrender of assets he acquired through illegal activities. And I think that's it. Like that's a really 12th housey, second housey set of keywords there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because he defrauded people through a complex scheme that primarily involved the misuse of customer funds deposited in his cryptocurrency exchange.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting. He has that Mars in a day chart, so the out of sec malefic ruling that Mercury, ruling the ruler of the second, and ruling the seventh house of like the other party. Um, Yeah, as well as Pluto there, not like Pluto by itself would, do all of this, but it's interesting that that's the same placement as Charles Ponzi.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So all of his assets were frozen. Um, he's got a crazy amount of legal fees, bail conditions, as well as numerous civil lawsuits from investors and creditors. So yeah, his once vast fortune has been decimated is one of the lines that I saw.
For sure. Yeah.
All right. So other ones, though, I found two others that were similar. One of them was recent, which was Gypsy Rose Blanchard was a story that was in the news over the past year. She has Libra rising and Scorpio is the second house, and it's ruled by Mars, which is in the 12th house, along with
Mhm.
Venus and Mercury.
Mhm.
So she ended up, um, this is kind of a complicated, how do you explain this one? Do you know?
Well, she was her mother I guess was faking the daughter's illness, this person's illness, and was like making her do lots of like surgeries and medications that she did not need and like harming her, in the process for years.
Yeah,
I
like
can't know,
she,
I can't remember how you pronounce the name of that, but
it's like Munchausen by proxy
yeah.
was potentially the disease that her mother had. And then the owner of the birth chart, the daughter, is like a survivor of that, where her
Hmm.
mother was keeping her sick and was forcing sometimes very extreme medical procedures on her that she didn't need,
Right.
which often left her in a wheelchair, and even surgeries that she didn't need.
Right.
So she was subjected to lifelong physical, mental, and medical abuse. So what ended up happening is she ended up getting a partner or a boyfriend, and the boyfriend, at her request, potentially ended up murdering the mother. And then both the boyfriend and Gypsy Rose Blanchard went to jail. But because of the circumstances surrounding her just sort of like torture, like growing up from her mother, she was only sentenced to like 10 years or something like that, but was released after serving 8 years. And in the meantime, while she was in prison, some like dramas were made or documentaries were made about her case, and she developed a sort of like following on social media, so that once she got out, over the past year, when she was released from prison, she's become successful as a result of that, as a result of the notoriety of going to jail for having murdered her mother or had her mother murdered. And so
Mhm.
she has like a book that's coming out later this year. She has a book deal and other sort of like deals like that. So it's something I can't fully articulate, but something about a connection between the second house of finances and the like 12th house of prison, and just that she's those two topics are intertwined here.
Right. Like if she hadn't gone to prison for that, like that, I mean, that's the thing that led to like her at least earning some income subsequently, was like that connection. And like interesting also with the Pluto in the second, because it's kind of like one of those like true crime things that becomes like in the popular imagination of society for a while. There's like, hordes of people who are like following this in fascination. So, on the one hand, her ascendant ruler in the 12th, closely conjoining Mars in a day chart was like really bad for her physically and I'm sure emotionally, right? Like just the circumstances of her growing up and getting like medically abused.
Which
And
itself was a form of like imprisonment. She was being
yeah,
imprisoned by her mother.
exactly. Yeah, that's what I was about to say. But then at the same time, Mars is the ruler of the second, and so like the circumstances of her earning an income are like related to like hard things that are related to prison.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, sometimes you just have those unique stories like that, and that's one of the ways that that can work out in obviously a very extreme scenario.
Yeah.
One other that I found that was actually similar like that was Amanda Knox, who has Gemini rising, Taurus on the 12th house, and the ruler is Venus, which is in Cancer in the second whole sign house, along with Mercury and the Sun. And Mercury is the ruler of the ascendant. And she famously, she was like an American from Seattle who went to study abroad for a year in Italy during college, but then her roommate was murdered, and she evidently was like falsely accused of the crime and then convicted and imprisoned for a period of time. But then later she was exonerated and released. And subsequent to that, has written books and done podcasts and other interviews related to it, um, as well as done some advocacy work, I think, for people that are falsely imprisoned.
Mm.
So I thought that was another interesting case where there's like a connection there between the 12th house and the second house.
Absolutely. Right. And of course, that'll play out differently for different people. Most people are not imprisoned who have a 12th house connection with the second. So don't worry if you have something like that in your chart. It's not always that, but sometimes it is literal like that.
Yeah, sometimes it can be very literal. And that's, what I said at the beginning of doing this was I was just looking for literal examples that fulfill some of the most basic ancient significations.
Hmm.
And so there's a whole range of other both positive and negative, or even like middle of the road significations for each of these houses that we're not getting to.
Hmm.
But the point here is instead just to demonstrate that some of the core significations that astrologers have always associated with those houses really do still work out, sometimes in very literal ways today.
Hmm. For sure. Yep. And seclusion, as we talked about earlier, is a much more common 12th house connection than, say, prisons. But, the commonality between the two, of course, is just like being away from everyday life.
Yeah, seclusion, and sometimes that's why it can represent not just, prisons, but also hospitals or,
Hmm.
sometimes I think monasteries or other places like that.
Yeah. I have a friend who has a connection between the second and 12th, and he's a doctor and works in hospitals. So there you go. It can be
Nice.
really positive.
Yeah, well, sometimes, in these instances, it's sometimes taking a bad experience that you've had in the past and then turning it into something positive for you that helps you to support your life in the future, I
Hmm.
think is the broadest way you can interpret that.
Yeah.
Or in the case of your friends, sometimes it's externalizing that and it's like taking something that's a bad experience for other people and
Hmm.
then, finding a way that can be something you do in order to help people that also supports you and your life and your livelihood,
Yeah, exactly.
which is also the case of some of these people to the extent that they become advocates for people that are suffering similar situations as them in the past.
For sure.
Yeah. And I am surprised, but that means we have reached the end of my chart examples and the end of this episode. I mean, unless you'd like to keep going, I mean, we could keep talking. I don't know. It's not a, I want to say not the longest episode I've ever done, definitely not the
Mhm.
shortest, but I think we covered an incredible amount of ground today.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is a great overview of the second house and different connections with the second house and how that plays out in terms of one's livelihood, income, possessions, etc.
Yeah, for sure. So there's probably other things we didn't get into, other ways of looking at the second house. Obviously, it wasn't comprehensive in terms of all planets in the second or all. The other thing is focused on celebrity examples in this episode
Hmm.
because their lives are like documented, because we have time charts for them, and because sometimes they show extremes of, good and bad scenarios, which is sometimes helpful because once you've established the extremes, then you can then sort of figure out what the intermediate steps are, like the moderate manifestations might be if you've seen what the utmost extreme is.
Right. The extremes sometimes make for better storytelling for the example purposes.
Exactly. So we're also in this series. This is only the second episode in this series. So we're going to continue to see other manifestations of the different houses as I go through each of these. So this was a kind of a crazy research project for me this month. I actually did it. I took longer on it than I might have because I've been sick and dealing with like brain fog and fatigue and long COVID stuff this month, but it actually interestingly allowed me to spend more time researching this than I did the first house episode, which was actually thrown together a little bit more quickly.
Mm.
Um, but I spent more time on this, but it also gave me more time to really find some great examples and come to some new realizations. So I really appreciated that. And I think I'll do my best to see if I can spend more time on other houses like I did, um, to whatever extent I can. Thankfully, I have a bunch of patrons that sign up through my page on patreon.com to support this work, and that's the reason I'm able to do this and to put this work out there for free instead of putting it behind a paywall. So if you got something valuable from this, then consider joining and becoming a patron, and in exchange, you'll get benefits like early access to new episodes and other stuff like that. Um, yeah, but otherwise, thanks to the patrons that supported this work so that I could do this research and put it out there. So for you, you are you've got stuff going on. You're potentially speaking at a conference next year at the Northwest Astrology Conference in Seattle, right?
Yes, I should be doing a lecture and workshop. All goes well between now and then. My website is lisaschaim.com. In the future, you will be able to visit it. It's down right now in preparation for a rebuild, but you should be able to see that in the future.
Yeah, you'll have some great lectures there for sale on things like annual perfections and zodiac releasing.
And election astrology, several things. Yeah.
Cool. All right. And then you'll be announcing that soon on the NORWAC website when that conference is out, what workshop you're going to be doing next May.
Yes, probably a ZR thing, but still working out the details.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that's it then. Thanks a lot for joining me and helping me to get this research out and these chart example. Thanks for talking it through and also letting me bug you every day for the past like 2 to 3 weeks constantly with like new examples that I would call you and then start babbling on about like the life of Madonna and like the details surrounding like all of the different intricacies of different people's lives.
Yeah, you're quite welcome. It was sort of a daily like, do you want to hear more examples?
Yeah. How many examples can you take today?
Yeah, yeah, but thanks for asking me. It was a fun discussion. Yeah, and I love seeing all of the astrology come to life. It's just always so fascinating and vivid, no matter how many charts you look at, just to see another one.
Yeah, for example, yeah, for sure, that it really comes alive once you start looking at examples. Because it's one thing to learn the principles, but then when you actually look at people's lives, you realize the principles, even if you don't expect it, like just come
hmm
alive in really unique and unusual ways that fulfill the basic concept and the system of astrology that we've had for 2000 years, but somehow that system still works stunningly today.
Right. Even if you can't think ahead of time of like how could this possibly manifest, or how specifically could that come about? And then you see, oh, okay, that's how.
Yeah, for sure. And I have lectures where I go into more of this in my Hellenistic astrology course. I forgot to mention because I tried to say I used some of the examples from my book and my course in this, but I also saved some that are just in the course and the book where I go into the ruler of the ascendant, the rulers of the houses, and other techniques more. So if people want to learn more about some of the techniques that we used in this, that would be where I would go. So you can find that at theastrologyschool.com. But otherwise, I think that's it for this episode. So thanks a lot for joining me today, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time. If you're a fan of the podcast and you'd like to support the production of future episodes, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to a bunch of benefits such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend live recordings, access to the monthly electional astrology podcast, access to another exclusive podcast called the Secret Astrology Podcast that's only available to patrons, or even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to patrons on our producers tier, including Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bozbaz, Kwatsi Alibarahu, and Annie Newman. If you're looking for an astrological consultation, then we have a new list of recommended astrologers on the podcast website. These astrologers offer birth chart readings, synastry, rectification, electional astrology, horary questions, and more. Go to theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software that we use on the Astrology Podcast is called Solar Fire for Windows, And you can get a 15% discount on the software by using the promo code AP15 when you purchase it through alabe.com. For Mac users, we recommend the program Astro Gold for Mac OS, and you can also get a 15% discount when you use the promo code AstroPodcast15 at the website astrogold.io. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then you should get a copy of my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, which is available in both print and now ebook forms, where I've started selling a PDF copy of the book through my website at hellenisticastrology.com/book. If you're really looking to deepen your studies of astrology, then check out my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology. It's perfect for beginner and intermediate students because I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, including monthly webinars and Q&A sessions. And at the end of the course, if you complete the final test, you'll receive a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me. You can find out more information at theastrologyschool.com.